In the heart of Germany's Black Forest, paths vanish into shadows where mist coils around ancient pines and silence carries a weight that feels almost alive. Hikers have disappeared without a trace. Strange figures have been glimpsed between gnarled trunks, and unexplainable lights have danced over cliffs and ravines. Following these hidden trails, we encounter a forest where the line between reality and the unknown blurs, each step revealing fragments of stories that have eluded explanation for generations. Within this ancient expanse, the familiar becomes unsettling, and every rustle, every whisper of wind hints at a presence just beyond sight. The Black Forest waits, patient and secretive, its dark heart guarding truths that no one has yet uncovered. The Vanished Hiker of Mummelsee. The story known today as the Vanished Hiker of Mummelsee drifts through the Black Forest with the quiet persistence of a rumour that refuses to fade, a tale anchored to a lake already steeped in centuries of superstition and whispered folklore. Mummelsee, lying high on the Hornisgrinde Massif, has long been associated with legends of water spirits, unexplained movements beneath its surface, and accounts of travellers who felt watched as they circled its mist-cloaked perimeter. It is within this landscape of deep waters and dense spruce that a modern disappearance took shape, one that seemed ordinary at first glance, yet left behind traces so unsettling that even experienced rescue teams struggled to explain them. The incident began on a mild October weekend when a solo hiker named Felix Brandt, a man familiar with Schwarzwald trails and not known for taking reckless detours, failed to return to his guest house only short distance from the lake's northern path. Reports from those who saw Felix earlier that morning suggested nothing unusual, though the timing of his walk aligned with the early hours when the lake often lay beneath a thin shroud of evaporating fog that curled around the water in pale, shifting veils. Witnesses later recalled how the air seemed unusually still, the kind of quiet that presses on the ears and makes ordinary forest sounds appear distant. When Felix set off on the circular trail that wrapped around Mummelsee, he walked with a steady pace, carrying a small pack stocked with a thermos, a field camera, and a folded map marked with only the most common routes. His plan, recorded in the guesthouse log, was simply to complete a 2-hour walk before breakfast, yet something along the shoreline shifted that ordinary intention into an unsettling mystery. Search teams, working from the point last confirmed by other hikers, found Felix's footprints clearly visible along the damp soil near the water's edge, continuing in a neat line for several meters before stopping abruptly only a few steps from the lake. The soil held no signs of sliding, stumbling or disturbance, details the forestry workers found particularly odd because the ground near Mummelsee is notoriously soft during autumn, often recording even the lightest movement with remarkable clarity. The absence of any continuation puzzled investigators, who examined the edges for signs of entry into the water, yet detected no splash marks or displaced stones that would indicate someone stepping or falling in. The footprints simply ended as though the hiker had stepped into open air.
Yeah.
Conditions on the morning of his disappearance made the scene even stranger. The water temperature, recorded by a nearby environmental station, remained nearly uniform at the surface, showing no unusual activity or thermal anomalies that could suggest underwater currents capable of pulling a person down without leaving visible traces. Additionally, boats dispatched across the lake within hours of the missing person report saw no floating gear, no ripples inconsistent with natural breeze patterns, and no shift in water coloration that might indicate sediment recently stirred from below. Despite the lake's depth reaching up to 18 meters, divers later stated that the clarity near the shallows was sufficient to confirm that no clothing or equipment lay concealed among the submerged branches. Investigators turned their attention to the forested slopes around the lake, where they followed faint animal trails and narrow clearings shaped by years of wandering visitors seeking solitude among the firs. The Black Forest in this region is known for its sudden inclines and hidden depressions, features that often complicate rescue operations, yet the search teams found no broken branches or displaced needles that might signal a sudden turn or attempted bushwhack. Instead, the forest seemed undisturbed, its floor blanketed with the usual mix of moss and pine needles that retained their untouched stillness. Even trained dogs, accustomed to tracking scents through rugged terrain, struggled to maintain a trail for more than a few meters before circling back with uncertainty. Local authorities consulted the lake's long cultural record, though not officially, because Mummelsee's folklore often sits awkwardly beside modern investigations. Still, the lake's reputation is impossible to ignore in such circumstances. For centuries, legends have told of Mummeln, water entities believed to lure travellers close to the shoreline during fog-laden mornings. These tales are often dismissed as storytelling devices for guiding children away from steep banks. Despite their mythic nature, the stories occasionally align with persistent accounts of people disappearing or losing a sense of direction near the lake, experiences recorded in local diaries from the 19th century and repeated in modern hiking forums, where visitors describe sudden feelings of disorientation, as though the air thickened around them. As the investigation continued, the only object belonging to Felix that eventually surfaced was his field camera, found by a jogger 2 days later, wedged between roots several metres uphill from where his footprints stopped. The device, still functioning despite the moisture in the forest air, contained only a handful of photographs taken that morning. Images showed ordinary scenes, a misplaced tree line, a close shot of the lake surface catching dawnlight, and a final photo depicting the opposite bank where fog drifted low in horizontal streaks. Analysts found nothing unusual within the images, though several viewers commented independently that the final photograph seemed to capture an unusual shift in the fog pattern, as though something darker hovered just beneath the surface reflection. Investigators expanded their search beyond the immediate lake, exploring branching trails that ran toward the Hornisgrinde slopes and the forest roads that linked to the Seebach region. Yet nothing suggested that Felix left the area willingly or consciously. His personal items remained untouched in the guest house. His bank activity ceased the moment he began his walk, and no sightings emerged along the highly trafficked lookout points that morning. The absence of concrete leads forced the case into the realm of unconfirmed theories, ranging from hidden sinkholes to sudden medical episodes to the more speculative suggestions, quietly shared by locals who have lived their whole lives near the lake's shifting fog. Seasonal visitors continued to walk the trail during the weeks that followed, often lingering at the spot where the footprints ended. Many reported a peculiar heaviness in the air there, not dramatic or frightening, but undeniably present, a sensation that made even experienced hikers pause. Rangers occasionally noted that small pockets of mist clung to that particular shoreline longer than to others, a detail they attributed to the lake's microclimate yet acknowledged as curious nonetheless. These observations never produced definitive answers, but they deepened the atmosphere around the case, reinforcing the feeling that something about that morning resisted rational unfolding. Despite extensive efforts, no body, clothing or equipment belonging to Felix was ever recovered, and the official investigation eventually closed without resolution. The footprints remained the most disturbing element of the case, a clear track of a person walking toward the water with calm intention before stopping in a place where nothing should have prevented the next step. That inexplicable halt left a lingering image that continues to shape the way the story is told, always returning to the question of how a man could vanish so completely within an area so small. And some say that on certain mornings, when the air settles low and silence presses against the lake, a single set of footprints appears in the damp soil before fading into nothing. The Triberg Black Figure reports. Triberg's narrow gorge, with its sweeping waterfalls and steep forested walls, has long carried more than the roar of water, and it is within this terrain that the first reports of a silent black figure began to surface. The town itself, famous for its cascading waterfalls that tumble in multiple tiers over granite cliffs, attracts tourists who traverse the trails in every season. Yet even among the countless hikers and visitors, whispers persisted of a tall, dark silhouette that seemed to linger just beyond sight, often appearing near the mist, heavy upper paths or between dense stands of fir and spruce that line the gorge. These accounts rarely matched expectations of ordinary wildlife or human presence, and locals spoke of the phenomenon with a cautious blend of intrigue and wariness, noting that the shape often appeared when light was fading and shadows stretched unnaturally long. One of the earliest accounts emerged from a hiker in the late 20th century who claimed he saw a motionless dark silhouette standing at a bend where the upper trail narrows against the cliff. According to his report, the figure remained entirely still despite the gusts of wind rustling the nearby branches, and it seemed to absorb the faint morning light rather than reflect it. The hiker described an unsettling sense of being observed, though he saw no face, no discernible features, only the impression of the immense height and a form slightly wider than that of a typical adult. For years, this solitary report might have been dismissed as a trick of light or an overactive imagination, but the precise location, near the edge of a precipice where the trail curves sharply, made the story linger in the minds of guides and forest wardens familiar with the layout. Decades later, newer reports began appearing online, each describing the same unnerving shape lingering near sections of the Triberg waterfall path, where shifting fog dulls the electric lights at dusk. Several hikers mentioned encountering the figure near the lower cascade platform, where the trail runs parallel to the stream and metal railings confine movement. Witnesses consistently noted that the figure maintained a position just beyond the safety barriers, vanishing whenever someone attempted to approach or pass along the path. Many of the accounts emphasized that it never caused panic. Rather, it provoked a quiet, unnerving awareness, as if the figure existed in a space just beyond the natural rhythm of the forest, observing without interacting. Posts and comments from multiple observers indicated that sightings occurred in varying seasons, from the lush greenery of summer to the snow-muffled silence of winter, hinting at a persistence beyond mere coincidence. Local rangers, accustomed to misidentified wildlife and overactive imaginations, investigated several of the sightings but found no footprints, no clothing scraps, and no signs of someone hiding along the trail. Their patrols covered both day and night shifts, and in every instance the terrain showed no disturbance except for the usual animal tracks of deer, fox, or occasional wild boar. Rangers familiar with the forest's layout noted that the angles of sight along the gorge, particularly near bends and lookout platforms, could create illusions under low light, yet the consistency of reports, height, stillness, and location defied any simple explanation. Even thermal cameras and night vision equipment deployed on repeated occasions failed to detect a moving body or heat signature that corresponded to the figure's alleged position, leaving only the subjective testimonies of visitors as evidence. The most unsettling incident occurred on a summer evening when 3 separate visitors, positioned at different points on the waterfall path, reported seeing the same tall figure standing utterly still above the gorge. One observer was on the upper platform, another halfway along the trail near the cascade, and a third closer to the town's edge. Each described a silhouette that matched in height and shape, despite differing vantage points and distances. Remarkably, all 3 accounts recorded the figure as remaining in position for approximately the same length of time before disappearing simultaneously. The phenomenon sparked both skepticism and awe among local authorities, as the synchronization of sightings suggested coordination beyond human capability or any easily observable natural cause. Attempts to explain the sightings often turned to environmental quirks, from distorted shadows to low-light illusions, yet each theory collapses when compared with the consistency of the figure's height and stillness. Atmospheric conditions in the gorge can create eerie optical effects. Mist condenses and swirls along the rock faces, light refracts off the waterfall's spray, and uneven terrain stretches shadows in ways that trick the eye. Yet even on clear nights without fog, witnesses described seeing the figure in positions impossible for a passerby to maintain without being seen. Biologists and wildlife experts proposed that large birds or deer might be misinterpreted, but none of the shapes recorded resembled known forest fauna, and no sounds accompanied the sightings that could suggest an animal presence. One particularly troubling report came from a visitor who followed the dark silhouette for several steps before watching it vanish at a fenced section of the path that offered nowhere for a person to slip away unseen. The observer, an amateur photographer, later described an abrupt disappearance with no sound, no rustling of branches, and no visual clues that might indicate a hiding spot. A review of the trail's maps confirmed that no side paths or hidden alcoves existed near the location. Attempts to replicate the scenario by walking the trail at the same hour produced only the observer's own shadows and the predictable play of light on rock and foliage. That the figure could vanish in such a precise spot, without disturbing the surrounding environment, remains among the most confounding aspects of the entire series of sightings. Over time, the black figure has woven itself into local storytelling, bolstered by older accounts from woodcutters and travellers who spoke of a lone watcher haunting the edges of the Schwarzwald paths. Histories compiled in the town archives recount tales of figures glimpsed near the waterfalls in the early 1800s, described as shadows that appeared along trails during long winter evenings. Folklorists suggest these may have originated as warnings for hikers to respect the dangerous terrain, yet contemporary reports show remarkable similarities to the centuries-old stories, hinting at a continuity that stretches across generations. The persistence of this figure has become part of Triberg's identity, a quiet, ever-present enigma that draws curiosity and unease in equal measure. A few who walk the gorge at night insist the figure still appears at the fringe of the lamplight, waiting in the place where the shadows settle deepest. The Feldberg missing skier incident. He'd started the descent with practiced confidence, yet something in the snow ahead made him hesitate, a fleeting sense that the trail itself had shifted beneath his feet before anyone could notice. The slope appeared ordinary at first, familiar to any visitor who had traversed Feldberg's winter runs dozens of times, yet a subtle unease settled over him as he scanned the forested edges of the piste. It was here, among the whispering firs and patches of untouched snow, that the skier first seemed to step into an anomaly, a space where light and shadow clung differently, and where the world felt quieter than it had moments before. By the time fellow skiers began to notice him moving off the groomed runs, the incident that would mark the mountain's history had already begun, though no one realised it at the time. Earlier that morning, the skier had left the lodge fully prepared, carrying poles, a backpack with essentials, and a GPS device clipped to his jacket. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and a thin layer of frost coated the upper slopes, glinting in the pale sunlight. He had intended a short routine descent along marked trails, descending from the lodge area to the lower stations, where ski lifts could whisk him back for lunch. Yet as he ventured farther from the main runs, the familiar paths seemed to fragment, leading him toward narrow, wooded descents where snow covered irregular dips in the terrain, and the slope's pitch increased unexpectedly. Other skiers glimpsed him taking unusual lines between the trees, veering into areas where the snow remained untouched and where the run dropped sharply beyond the edge of the maintained trail. From their vantage points, they could see him weaving carefully, adjusting his balance as the sunlight flickered through the spruce and fir. Yet there was a peculiar stillness to his movement, as though he were aware of a presence they could not see. A sense of disorientation spread among those watching, reinforced by the way shadows fell across the gullies and pockets of snow drifted in small curling waves along the slopes. It was only moments later that he vanished completely from view, leaving behind a faint GPS signal and no other trace that could explain his sudden disappearance. Those nearest the edge of the trail reported catching only a glimpse of movement before the skier seemed to dissolve into the white and green of the forest. Snow underfoot remained undisturbed along the main track, with no signs of a fall or equipment lost in the trees. The abrupt cessation of the GPS signal added a layer of technical mystery, as if the device itself had been swallowed along with the skier. Rescue teams moved swiftly, combing both the groomed trails and the surrounding off-piste slopes with avalanche dogs, snowmobiles, and handheld thermal imaging devices. Despite their methodical search, they uncovered nothing beyond scattered impressions of snow and the skier's abandoned equipment, which appeared untouched near a curve of the upper trail. Measurements recorded during the search indicated visibility limited to no more than 50 meters in areas where fog had begun to drift across the gullies. Yet even in clearer zones, the searchers found no evidence of passage. Every track seemed to terminate abruptly, as if the mountain itself had swallowed the skier whole. Eyewitnesses provided fragmented accounts that added more questions than answers. Some claimed they'd seen a dark figure climb a ridge between the trees, moving in a manner inconsistent with skiing, while others reported tracks leading up small rises before ending on steep embankments with no escape route. Nothing aligned neatly with the topography, leaving rescuers puzzled over how a single person could leave such contradictory traces. The interplay of shadows, uneven snow, and steep gullies compounded the uncertainty, making each report a small fragment of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Even the most advanced tools, drones scanning tree lines, GPS triangulation, and aerial thermal cameras, failed to detect the skier. The forested slopes of Feldberg, while not vast, contained pockets of dense firs and shadowed gullies where snowpack shifted silently, masking every potential footprint. Wind gusts swept across ridges in patterns that sometimes mimicked movement, and the low winter sun elongated shadows into shapes that could be mistaken for a human form. Yet every attempt to reconcile these natural phenomena with the observed disappearance fell short. The skier had seemingly evaporated from both sight and technology simultaneously. Gradually, the disappearance joined Feldberg's older stories of hikers swallowed by sudden blizzards or who disappeared within sight of the lodge. Locals recalled stories passed down about the mountain's capricious nature, its ability to hide travellers even on clear days, and the unpredictable ways in which snow and shadows could disorient the most experienced visitors. The missing skier became a part of this continuum, a reminder that the slopes held secrets beyond maps, GPS, or the careful observation of ski patrols. The event lingered in memory as a quiet, persistent anomaly, a mystery embedded in the winter forest that no one could explain. Those who venture onto the high ridges still claim they sense movement where no tracks exist, as if the mountain itself has kept him hidden in plain sight. The Holland phantom carriage. A sudden clatter echoed through the narrow gorges of Holland, followed by a low, rolling rumble that seemed too heavy for the thin mountain road, and it was here that travellers first whispered of the phantom carriage. The valley, hemmed in by steep slopes and dense stands of fir and spruce, carried every sound further than might be expected, yet the echo of the carriage's wheels, reported as wooden and hollow, felt deliberate and impossible, as if the noise belonged to a vehicle from another age. Those who passed the valley in the late afternoon often described a sensation of being watched or accompanied by a presence just beyond the periphery, and many felt a sudden chill along the spine as the sound drew nearer, only to vanish before anyone could identify its source. The earliest mentions of the carriage appear in letters and local newspapers from the late 1800s, describing a dark, hooded coach pulled by shadowy horses that vanished as abruptly as it appeared along the winding valley roads. Travellers recorded their astonishment and fear, noting that the roads of Holland were narrow and treacherous, and the apparition seemed to glide over terrain that no ordinary carriage could traverse safely. One account from 1872 tells of a courier who saw the vehicle emerge from thick morning fog, its black silhouette perfectly framed against the cliffs, and disappear into a curve just beyond the reach of daylight. These early records, though sparse, set the template for the countless reports that would follow in the next century. Time and again, witnesses reported identical eerie features: a wooden carriage, wheels that floated silently over stone, and hooves striking the cliffs with unnatural rhythm. Some reported seeing a hooded figure, seated upright and motionless, holding reins in hands that seemed unnervingly pale against the dark coach. Others spoke of the horse's eyes, reflecting light even in dim conditions, or of a faint acrid smell reminiscent of burning wood or iron. The combination of visual, auditory and olfactory impressions left travellers disoriented, unable to track the apparition along the valley's winding curves, and unsure whether they had seen a trick of fog and shadow or something far more inexplicable. In more recent decades, hikers and motorists recounted glimpses of the carriage emerging from fog banks or rounding blind curves, often coinciding with sudden gusts of wind or temperature drops along the valley floor. A motorist in the 1990s described rounding a bend where the asphalt narrows between sheer cliffs when a black carriage appeared directly ahead, silent and solid, only to vanish when the vehicle accelerated a few meters closer. Another report from a winter hiker notes that the apparition glided along a ridge no wider than 2 meters, its wheels leaving no impression in the hard-packed snow. These modern accounts echo the details from the 19th century, suggesting a continuity that defies simple explanation. Skeptics and historians proposed rational explanations, attributing the sounds to avalanches, echoing vehicles, or light refracted through dense mist. Yet these theories faltered when compared with the precise timing and repetition of sightings. Acousticians studying the valley note that Holland's steep slopes and deep gorges can carry even minor noises across surprising distances, yet nothing in the environment can reproduce the simultaneous appearance of visual, auditory, and tactile sensations reported by witnesses. Attempts to simulate the conditions on foggy evenings produced only partial echoes and light distortions, failing to replicate the coordinated experience described in multiple independent reports. Some accounts report phenomena that defy easy explanation: dogs barking wildly at empty paths, lanterns dimming as the carriage passes, and travellers feeling a sudden chill despite the calm winter air. A group of hikers once described stepping off a road to avoid the apparition, only to notice frost forming rapidly on nearby branches, though ambient temperatures had remained steady. Horses in nearby stables occasionally reacted to unseen presences along the valley, shying and neighing as if acknowledging a companion invisible to humans. Such reports, while anecdotal, consistently accompany sightings, reinforcing the sense that the carriage exists within the environment in a way that interacts subtly with natural forces. In Holland, the phantom carriage gradually entered the local consciousness, inspiring legends, warnings, and journaled advisories for those who might venture into the valley. Folk songs, poems, and occasional theatrical reenactments commemorate the spectral coach, portraying it as a guardian of the valley or a harbinger for those travelling after dusk. Scholars of German folklore note that Hollandtal's geography, a combination of cliffs, narrow roads, and persistent fog, creates ideal conditions for such enduring legends, yet the remarkable consistency of the carriage's reported behaviour continues to intrigue both locals and visitors. Though the valley has seen advances in road safety, lighting, and terrain surveillance, tales persist, with locals continuing to glimpse a hooded figure riding through the fog along the old paths. Observers emphasise that even when the roads are well maintained and visibility is clear, the carriage sometimes appears in precisely the locations described over a century ago, a pattern that no practical explanation fully accounts for. Tour guides occasionally pause near the old bends, recounting the stories to tourists who strain their eyes toward the misty curves, half expecting to see wheels gliding silently over stone. Even now, those who traverse Holland till after dusk claim that somewhere beyond sight and sound, the carriage still rolls along the hidden curves of the valley, carrying passengers from a time long forgotten. The Ravenna Gorge bridge lights. It began with a sudden glow hovering above the Ravenna Gorge bridge, pale and quivering, drawing the gaze of a lone motorist who could not place its source among the familiar contours of stone and river below. The bridge itself, spanning the narrow shadowed gorge with its wrought iron railings and cobblestone walkways, seemed ordinary under the fading light, yet the illumination above appeared neither attached to the structure nor moving like any vehicle. The glow fluctuated, sometimes stretching along the valley, condensing into a single bright point, and the motorist, frozen in place, could only watch as it pulsed in rhythm with the whispering wind, leaving a trace of unease that clung long after the lights vanished. Accounts of lights at the bridge stretch back decades. Early 20th century letters and local newspapers hint at similar phenomena, often described as floating lanterns or shimmering points that appeared without explanation. One article from 1923 recounted a traveller's astonishment as a line of pale fire danced above the bridge at dusk, vanishing suddenly as if drawn into the shadows. Local historians note that Hollandtal and the Ravenna Gorge have long been prone to optical oddities due to the cliffs, fog-prone microclimates, and reflections from the dark waters below, yet none of these factors can fully account for the precise timing and repeated appearance of the lights over the decades. Observers repeatedly describe the lights as varying in intensity, sometimes golden, other times icy white, moving in arcs across the gorge or pulsing as if aware of those standing along the bridge railings. One visitor in the early 1980s described the lights climbing slowly above the railing, hovering briefly, and then retreating toward the cliff face as though acknowledging the observer's presence. Another reported a sequence of orbs weaving around the arches of the bridge, their illumination reflecting off the stone and water in ways that created the impression of multiple shapes moving independently yet in concert. Travellers, photographers, and passing drivers recall the uncanny reflection of the lights in the dark waters below, which occasionally seemed to double or fragment, creating shapes that defied conventional perception. Photographs taken on foggy evenings often reveal bright streaks where the light seems to have been reflected and refracted by the river, yet in the same images, observers swear they can see independent points of light suspended above the water's surface. A group of hikers described standing on the stone walkway while the lights traced circular patterns, then vanished, leaving the river completely dark except for their lingering reflections in the mist. Occasionally the lights appear to interact with the bridge's structural elements, casting shadows that stretch across the stone arches in ways no ordinary illumination could produce. Engineers and local historians note that the Ravenna Gorge Bridge, constructed in the late 19th century, has narrow lattice supports and deep archways that could reflect and scatter light naturally, yet the movements observed by witnesses often defy these known angles. Photographers attempting to capture the phenomenon report that beams appear to bend around corners or vanish behind pillars, only to emerge in entirely unexpected positions, as if the lights navigate the bridge independently of the physical environment. The river below, typically dark and reflective, sometimes mirrors the glow in multiple layers, creating the impression of lights floating both above and below the bridge simultaneously, further confounding attempts to locate a conventional source. Explanations range from headlamps and reflective road signs to atmospheric refractions, yet investigations using long-exposure photography, laser measurement, and careful mapping of sightlines failed to replicate the patterns recorded by multiple independent accounts. Technicians and amateur astronomers examined humidity levels, fog density, and even the slope of the valley walls, attempting to identify natural lenses or light distortions that could create the illusion, but every attempt fell short. The repeated consistency of the phenomenon under varying weather and seasonal conditions suggested something beyond a simple trick of optics, prompting both fascination and frustration among those attempting rational explanations. Several reports described the lights synchronizing with sudden gusts of wind or shifting fog, vanishing entirely only to reappear moments later in locations impossible to trace by ordinary movement. One motorist recalled accelerating along the bridge only to see the lights leap ahead of the vehicle without any physical bridge or terrain to account for the movement. Hikers in winter described the glow fading into the mist, then reappearing downstream or high above the gorge, in positions that made no sense in relation to the slope or river. Each observation reinforced the sense that the lights were not bound by conventional physics, moving with an intent or pattern that remained beyond comprehension. Across decades, the phenomenon has captured both curiosity and superstition, with locals weaving it into storytelling, while amateur photographers attempt to capture its fleeting presence for social media and personal records. The bridge became a site of quiet pilgrimage for those drawn to unexplained occurrences, and local guides would caution visitors that the lights appeared most often when fog settled into the gorge in the late evening. Travellers would recount their experiences to others, often embellishing details of movement, colour or intensity, yet the consistency in reported locations and timing created an unmistakable pattern that lent credibility to the mystery. With brighter bridge lighting and added surveillance, sightings continue, hinting that the lights possess a persistence and mobility that elude conventional understanding. Engineers noted that even modern LED fixtures installed along the railings failed to influence or diminish the phenomenon, and cameras aimed at the gorge often captured nothing when witnesses described the lights as appearing and vanishing. The repeated, unexplained appearances ensure that the Ravenna Gorge Bridge retains its reputation as a place where the ordinary bends into the extraordinary, where technology and human observation collide with something still unresolved. Visitors who linger on the bridge after dark claim the lights still appear, flickering and shifting as if carrying secrets too vast for human eyes to follow. The Disappearance in Zastler Valley. Dense fir and beech trees lined the steep slopes of Zastler Valley, muffling sound and swallowing light, and it was into this shadowed expanse that a small group vanished one late autumn afternoon. The valley, part of the southern Black Forest, is renowned for its twisting ravines, rushing streams and moss-covered undergrowth that thickens at higher altitudes, creating an environment that tests even the most experienced hikers. Local guides often caution that a single wrong step can send someone tumbling into concealed hollows, yet the group's disappearance seemed to occur without any trace of misfortune, amplifying the sense that the forest had claimed them with unnatural precision. The last known location placed them near a narrow footbridge over the icy Zastlerbach, where the ground drops sharply and the forest floor disappears into thick undergrowth, a spot notoriously difficult to navigate even in daylight. One member had been attempting to photograph the autumn foliage reflecting in the stream, while others paused to rest on rocks coated with damp moss. Witnesses reported the weather shifted suddenly, with a bank of dense cloud descending from the ridges, reducing visibility to only a few meters. The interplay of mist and shadows rendered familiar paths disorienting, and the group vanished before any clear signals of their direction could be determined. Search parties, comprising local rangers, volunteers and canine units, combed the slopes for days, employing drones, maps, and even thermal imaging to trace every conceivable path through the valley's twisting ravines and hidden hollows. Teams had to contend with fallen trees, tangled underbrush, and the intricate network of tributaries feeding into the Zastler, each stream capable of erasing footprints within minutes. Aerial reconnaissance revealed patches of fog so dense that even the most sophisticated equipment struggled to penetrate, leaving large portions of the valley effectively invisible. Every expedition returned with frustration mounting, as carefully planned search grids often led to nothing but damp foliage and scattered leaves. Weather conditions conspired against them. Sudden fogs rolled down the ridges, rivers swelled with unseasonal rainfall, and the uneven terrain concealed not only footprints, but any trace of human passage within hours. Rangers recounted that even trained dogs occasionally refused to follow certain scents, as if the valley itself resisted being read. Nightfall added another layer of difficulty, with howling winds echoing through the gorge and shadows transforming every rock and tree into potential hazards. By the end of the first week, hopes of locating the missing dwindled beneath the oppressive forest canopy and the growing silence that seemed almost unnatural. Villagers and hikers reported odd sounds along the trails, snapping branches, fleeting shadows, and distant calls that could not be matched to wildlife, adding an unsettling dimension to the official search. One retired hunter described hearing voices calling for help, yet each time he followed the sounds, he encountered nothing but swaying branches and the restless murmur of the Zastler. Another hiker reported a fleeting silhouette on the ridge above, standing motionless before dissolving into the fog. The repetition of these observations, recorded independently over several days, suggested that either the valley was playing tricks on perception or that some unknown force had altered the normal course of events entirely. Investigators considered every plausible scenario, from accidental falls and animal attacks to disorientation or hypothermia, yet each hypothesis struggled against the stark fact that no body or personal belongings were ever recovered. Teams combed gullies and cliffs, examined ravines for signs of struggle, and surveyed the area for discarded clothing or equipment, but the valley returned nothing. Even where the terrain offered no obvious escape routes, the group's traces seemed to vanish, creating a gap between reality and expectation that baffled both local authorities and search specialists alike. Equipment left behind by the search teams occasionally yielded subtle clues: damp footprints on moss-covered rocks, oddly arranged stones near the riverbank, or fleeting impressions in soft soil that teased the possibility of movement yet vanished before being fully documented. Rangers noted that these traces were often inconsistent. Footprints appeared too large or small, impressions sometimes ended abruptly on flat ground, and stones moved into patterns that were never repeated. Attempting to follow these hints frequently led searchers into improbable locations, such as cliff edges, dense thickets, or areas under sudden fog banks, reinforcing the valley's reputation as a place that can erase or redirect human passage with eerie precision. The valley itself carries a history of warnings and folklore, with older accounts describing sudden mists and lost travellers, and the disappearance only intensified the enduring sense that Zastler's slopes guard secrets beyond ordinary comprehension. Records dating back to the 18th century describe hikers and hunters who are separated from companions, often returning disoriented or not at all, with survivors recounting sudden fogs and distorted paths. Locals whisper of hidden hollows where time seems to stretch, and the forest exerts a quiet dominance over those who enter unprepared, lending the modern disappearance a resonance that blends documented hazard with the uncanny. Even years later, hikers report feeling a weight of absence and quiet unease in sections of the valley where the missing were last seen, as if the forest itself remembers and conceals what occurred. Moss-covered rocks, rushing streams, and shadowed footpaths continue to inspire caution, and the legend of the disappearance has become inseparable from the valley's identity. The place remains a testament to human vulnerability, where environmental extremes and unexplained elements converge in a way that defies full understanding, leaving the forest both beautiful and forbidding. In Zastler Valley, the quiet today carries a weight beyond normal silence, and some visitors feel an elusive, mysterious presence where the group was last known. The strange echoes of Wolfsschlucht. Wolfsschlucht winds through the southern Black Forest in deep, narrow gorges where the Wolfsschlucht River cuts jagged channels into limestone cliffs, and it is here that a peculiar phenomenon, known among hikers as the strange echoes of Wolfsschlucht, has baffled visitors for decades. The gorge stretches for several kilometres, with steep walls rising as much as 100 metres in places, narrowing to channels that trap sound and create pockets where every noise seems amplified, prolonged, or oddly distorted. Vegetation clings to cliffs in scattered patches, and moss-draped boulders line the riverbed, further scattering sound in unpredictable ways. Yet, even accounting for natural acoustics, those who have walked the gorge report experiences that defy explanation, leaving lingering unease long after they have left the area. Early reports describe voices and footsteps reverberating through this canyon with such clarity that hikers initially believed others were nearby, only to discover that the gorge remained empty and silent beyond the flowing river. One visitor recounted pausing to call out to a supposed companion and hearing their own words returned, but warped into a sequence of tones and echoes that did not correspond to the surrounding landscape. Others describe hearing faint laughter or the sound of crunching leaves along paths where no one could have been, as if the forest and river were producing their own sentient mimicry. These sounds, subtle yet unmistakable, have been reported across multiple points of the gorge, suggesting that the phenomenon is persistent and widespread. Repeated incidents along different sections of the gorge suggest a pattern. Sounds appear most sharply near steep limestone walls, where the river's turbulence amplifies the natural acoustics, yet the echoes often produce tones and delays that do not align with conventional physics. The narrow channels act like natural megaphones, reflecting some sounds with extraordinary clarity, while allowing others to vanish entirely, producing a dissonant effect that can confuse the mind and sense of direction. Observers have noted that echoes sometimes appear to originate from places where the river has no path, or even from behind entirely inaccessible cliffs, creating the unsettling impression that the canyon itself is alive with its own hidden voice. Researchers and park officials conducted acoustic measurements using microphones and digital analyzers, attempting to map how sound travels through the narrow ravines, only to find that some echoes seem to originate from points that did not exist or bypassed known reflective surfaces entirely. Sound engineers measured the canyon's natural reverberation time, the impact of the river's flow, and the effects of overhanging rock ledges, yet certain echoes continued to appear beyond logical prediction. Attempts to recreate the phenomenon using recorded sounds also failed, suggesting that the experience is dependent on subtle, perhaps transient environmental conditions. While most echoes could be attributed to natural acoustics, a subset consistently resisted explanation, prompting speculation that Wolfsschlucht produces auditory anomalies unique to its geography. Even when controlled tests were performed, certain echoes returned at unexpected intervals, resembling faint conversation, laughter, or footsteps, leading some observers to question whether the gorge itself might harbour a natural anomaly that bends or manipulates sound. Hikers have reported standing in silence when, moments later, a voice-like sound called their name or repeated a phrase they had just spoken. Others describe hearing footfalls or the rustle of clothing in areas too steep or narrow for any human presence. Scientists documented these instances with sensitive recording devices, capturing sound waves that defied conventional acoustic models, leaving open the question of whether some unknown physical property, or even a perceptual quirk unique to the human ear, was at work. Historical accounts from the 19th century record similar experiences, with travellers and hunters describing voices in the mist, and instruments that registered sounds with no identifiable source, suggesting that the echoes have long haunted those who venture into the gorge. Local folklore speaks of wandering spirits or forest guardians, whose presence is sensed but never confirmed, tales that were once dismissed as superstition but gained credibility in light of modern reports. Early hikers noted that the canyon's walls sometimes produce a humming or whispering when the wind and water flow at certain speeds, and even older journals mentioned feeling watched or followed by sounds that did not belong to any visible creature. These enduring stories underscore the gorge's reputation as a place where human understanding reaches its limits. Hikers often report a subtle unease as the sounds distort their perception of distance and direction, forcing them to pause or retrace their steps, and in some cases, causing experienced guides to admit a rare disorientation amid familiar trails. The echoes can make a short walk feel longer, steps appear misplaced, or paths seem to curve unexpectedly. Even those accustomed to wilderness navigation describe a creeping hesitation as if the gorge itself demands attention and caution. Many speak of a pressure in the air, a tension that accompanies the anomalous sounds, adding to the impression that Wolfsschlucht is more than a passive landscape. It is a place where the ordinary rules of perception falter. The echoes, studied repeatedly and pondered endlessly, remain unexplained, puzzling all who hear them and deepening Wolfsschlucht's reputation for blending the natural with the uncanny. Each year, new hikers report familiar but unexplainable experiences, perpetuating the lore of voices and sounds that belong to no one. The gorge maintains its character as a living laboratory of nature and mystery, one where even the most rigorous observation cannot fully untangle the interplay between environment and perception. Lingering in the gorge, a pause often brings a heightened awareness of subtle sounds or movement, as Wolfsschlucht can turn quiet into something unsettling. The river's roar, the rustle of leaves, and the sharp angles of limestone cliffs combine to produce a landscape that seems at once alive and unknowable. In the fading light of dusk, those who stay in the gorge occasionally swear the echoes carry messages impossible for any human to utter. The Zarten nocturnal whistles. A sudden sharp whistle broke the quiet of the night, startling a group of hikers who had been sharing stories by their campfire, each one certain the sound was closer than it could be. The air was cold and still, with only the soft rustle of pine needles underfoot, yet the sound pierced through the darkness with a clarity that no ordinary wind or wildlife could explain. One hiker instinctively turned toward the noise, expecting to see another camper or perhaps an animal, but the forest remained empty, shadows folding over themselves in the moonlight. That night, the hikers would later describe the sound as distinct, almost musical, as if a human or some intelligent presence were deliberately sending a signal through the still black forest air. Another witness described the sound weaving through the trees like a restless spirit, rising in pitch and then dropping, leaving them uncertain whether it was a call or a warning. They reported that it seemed to move, shifting from one side of the valley to the other, and yet no branch or undergrowth moved to produce it. Some suggested the sound resembled the whistle of a small bird or the echo of a distant train, but the tone carried a precision and cadence that no known animal could replicate. At times, the sound appeared to respond to their own movements, echoing as if aware of their attempts to locate its source, and by the end of the night the hikers were both fascinated and unnerved, reluctant to venture further along the narrow trails. Park officials equipped with audio recorders noticed that the phenomenon did not follow any predictable path. Some whistles seemed to leap from one hilltop to another, ignoring the forest's usual acoustic properties. During field studies, microphones placed along known trails captured sequences of sounds that were impossible to trace back to any natural origin. The recordings showed abrupt changes in pitch and timing, sometimes separated by seconds, that made the echo appear instantaneous or even anticipatory. Even the most experienced rangers admitted that the phenomenon did not conform to conventional sound physics, and several researchers began to speculate whether an environmental anomaly or some yet undiscovered acoustic property of the valley might be responsible. One hiker attempted to trace the sound along a familiar trail, but the sequence of whistles always shifted, appearing behind, above, or beside him in ways that defied ordinary explanation. At times, the notes would seem to move downhill in tandem with the river, only to jump uphill into an inaccessible ridge. Others reported the sounds fading just as they approached, leaving the listener disoriented and questioning their own perception. These shifting patterns were consistent across multiple reports and decades, suggesting that the phenomenon was not isolated to one area of Zarten, nor limited to a single type of observer. Stories preserved from the 19th century describe fleeting valley whistles, interpreted by villagers as either messages from forest spirits or forewarnings of approaching events. Old diaries describe shepherds and hunters pausing mid-step, convinced that invisible voices were moving through the woods. Folklore passed down over generations attributes these sounds to Waldgeister, or forest spirits, though modern listeners are left to wonder whether superstition, coincidence, or something genuinely unexplained lies behind the phenomenon. These historical connections lend a sense of continuity, showing that the whistles have intrigued, unnerved, and fascinated humans for more than a century. Those who have heard the whistles often describe an immediate tension, a subtle tightening in the chest, and a sense that their senses are being subtly manipulated by the unseen source of the sound. nighttime explorers report a heightened awareness, in which familiar trails suddenly feel unfamiliar and distances seem distorted. Even experienced hikers, accustomed to navigation by the river and ridgelines, admit to hesitating or retracing steps after hearing the distinct calls. The effect is not simply fear, it is a disorientation intertwined with curiosity, a compulsion to understand what cannot be located or explained. Modern acoustic research using directional microphones and spectral analysis has failed to reproduce certain whistles, suggesting they are either highly transient or shaped by environmental factors beyond current scientific understanding. Some recordings captured tonal qualities with sharp overtones that shifted mid-note, a characteristic that conventional physics cannot fully account for. When researchers played these recordings for witnesses in controlled settings, many reported that the sounds still evoked the same sense of presence and movement, indicating that the experience was as psychological as it was physical, a blending of perception, environment, and mystery. The echoes persist today, reported by hikers, nighttime joggers, and wildlife enthusiasts. And while some remain skeptical, the consistency of the experience across generations has solidified the phenomenon as a lasting mystery of Hinter Zarten. Even with modern understanding of sound propagation, forest acoustics, and human auditory perception, the whistles continue to confound, prompting ongoing fascination among those drawn to the unknown. Each encounter adds another layer to the story, reinforcing Hinter Zarten's reputation as a place where the ordinary rules of sound and perception are challenged, leaving lingering questions long after the night has passed. At times, in the stillest hours of night, the whistles return in a pattern that feels almost conversational, as though the forest itself is attempting to speak. The Todtnau woodcutter's last marks. A series of freshly cut notches and deep gashes on fallen firs in a remote section of Todtnau drew the attention of local hikers and quickly became known as the woodcutter's last marks, a puzzle that resisted easy explanation. The forest itself seemed undisturbed, apart from the irregular scars on the timber, yet the precision of each mark hinted at a purpose beyond ordinary labour. Moss-covered rocks and shifting patches of sunlight created a subtle interplay of light and shadow, which only enhanced the sense that these marks were deliberately left for unseen eyes. It was not long before the story of the woodcutter's final traces spread quietly among local villagers, carrying whispers of mystery that would linger for decades. The first to examine them closely was a forestry worker, who noticed that the axe strokes differed from typical logging patterns, with unusual depth and spacing that suggested deliberate design rather than ordinary labour. The cuts were unusually deep in some areas, barely scraping the surface in others, forming patterns that neither matched conventional forestry techniques nor any known local craftsmanship. The worker traced the line of marks through the thick undergrowth, noting how the trajectory appeared to follow a hidden logic, as if a map had been etched across the forest floor in the language of wood and bark. The precision seemed almost ritualistic, yet no ritual from Todtnau's history could account for such a sequence. Documentation reveals that Todtnau's woodcutters worked on strict seasonal timetables for decades, yet the techniques and spacing of the cuts conflicted with standard practices. Woodcutters were known to employ consistent felling angles, standardized log lengths, and specific stacking methods, all optimized for efficiency and safety. These marks, however, defied those norms. Some trees bore slices that ended abruptly in mid-trunk, while others showed deliberate gouges at angles rarely used for timber extraction. Even comparing them to 19th century logging patterns in regional archives yielded no parallel, leaving historians and foresters equally confounded. A detailed survey revealed additional traces: faint footprints partially preserved in moss, irregular bark peelings, and small piles of wood chips arranged almost like markers along a narrow, twisting trail. Observers noted that the footprints suggested a solitary figure, yet the stride and gait varied subtly, as though the person had changed direction or weight unexpectedly. The bark peelings were not random. Some were arranged in clusters that appeared to align with natural features such as rocks or tree stumps, implying a deliberate orientation. Small piles of discarded timber chips punctuated the path, forming a silent rhythm that could be read, though no one had yet decoded its meaning. Analysis of the surrounding soil revealed small fragments of iron nails and bits of charred wood, suggesting that the woodcutter may have worked near temporary fire pits or improvised shelters while leaving the marks. The fragments hinted at a transient presence, perhaps someone living off the forest during the period of the carvings. Soil sampling also uncovered faint traces of resin and pine sap smudges along the notched trees, indicating repeated handling of timber and possibly even ritualistic attention to certain trees. Such details provide a subtle but compelling clue that the woodcutter's work was not purely practical, as each cut and surrounding artifact hints at patterns of movement, time spent and intent beyond ordinary logging activity. Careful inspection suggested that the woodcutter may have intended a message, though the exact meaning of the uneven notches and patterned debris remained concealed beneath layers of lichen and soil. The alignment of cuts and scattered chips hinted at symbolic intent, resembling a sequence or code known only to the maker. Researchers speculated on possible functions, directional markers for hidden caches, a personal record of labour, or perhaps a warning to others traversing the forest. Whatever the intention, the marks were too deliberate to dismiss, yet too obscure to interpret definitively, creating a tension between understanding and uncertainty. Stories passed down among villagers spoke of workmen who vanished unexpectedly, leaving only the faint echo of labour behind, and these oral accounts added a haunting resonance to the otherwise tangible evidence. Elders recalled tales of men who disappeared mid-task, sometimes leaving tools abandoned in the forest or partially felled trees, as if interrupted by some invisible presence. One narrative described a woodcutter seen carefully measuring trees and carving symbols into bark who was never heard from again. Such accounts merged seamlessly with the visible marks, giving them a layer of folklore that both enriched and obscured the factual record. Scientific examination offered some clarity. Measurements of axe angles, timber types, and the age of cut branches revealed a sequence of activity, but no known purpose could fully account for the arrangement left in the clearing. Dendrochronology confirmed that the cuts were recent relative to the oldest surrounding trees, and the timber itself was typical of the area, spruce and fir native to Todtnau. Yet the sequence, irregular spacing, and selective choice of branches suggested a deliberate pattern not dictated by utility. Specialists could trace the progression of the work, but whether it represented a personal ritual, a message, or something else entirely remained a question without an answer. Even those familiar with the forest rhythms felt unease when retracing the path, as if the traces themselves had been left for observers, deliberately unexplainable and perpetually out of reach. The forest, dense with undergrowth and steeped in centuries of human activity, seemed to frame the marks as a silent challenge. Shadows fell differently on the notches at different times of day, and the whisper of wind through the trees carried a subtle sense of anticipation, as though the forest itself guarded the secret. Each revisit revealed details previously unnoticed: moss patterns, small depressions in soil, the subtle curve of a branch, all conspiring to create an experience that was tangible yet elusive. The Todtnau marks endure as a silent testament to a hand and mind now vanished, leaving the forest as both keeper and enigma of a story no one has yet unravelled. The St. Märgen distant choir phenomenon. A solitary figure moved through the dense morning fog of St. Märgen, only to be startled by a sound that seemed both impossibly distant and unnervingly close, a chorus of voices weaving through the valley like threads of wind. The notes were not carried by any nearby human presence. No shepherds, musicians, or travellers could account for the harmonies that rose and fell among the mist-shrouded trees. Hikers later described the same sensation, an invisible ensemble whose presence felt tangible yet elusive, echoing across ridges and around the gnarled trunks of ancient firs that lined the valley floor. Even the way the sound seemed to bend and linger in the cold morning air suggested an origin that was at once natural and profoundly inexplicable. Long-time residents of the village speak quietly of evenings when the air trembled with harmonies no choir could produce, recalling moments that blurred memory, myth, and reality. Some recalled hearing the voices as children, standing at the edge of their windows while fog rolled in from the hills, their parents dismissing the noises as distant farm labour or the wind through the trees. Yet these stories persisted, repeated with subtle variations that suggested not imagination, but a shared experience spanning generations. In some cases, the voices appeared to respond to human movement, rising in clarity when one paused to listen, then fading abruptly when approached, as though the forest itself were aware. Electronic devices captured nothing more than faint static and the occasional wind gust, yet observers swore that the ethereal harmonies had been present, defying measurement and explanation. Acoustic engineers visiting the area noted that the valley's shape could naturally amplify and distort sounds, but the clarity, timbre and timing of the choir seemed inconsistent with ordinary echoes. Microphones placed along multiple ridges produced recordings that either failed to detect the choir entirely or captured only faint, dissonant murmurs, leaving a puzzle that modern technology could not solve. Each failed attempt only heightened the mystery, lending weight to the villagers' insistence that the phenomenon eluded scientific capture. Fog-heavy mornings and bitter winter evenings seemed to coax the voices from the valleys, while summer warmth or sunlit clarity often silenced them, revealing the forest's subtle influence on sound. Temperature inversions common in St. Märgen may contribute to the effect, bending sound waves across distances that would normally be imperceptible. The chorus often appeared most vivid during still, overcast conditions when mist hung low and light was muted, giving the entire valley a muted, ethereal glow. Hikers who timed their visits to these specific conditions frequently reported the choir with startling precision, while those in sunlight or wind often heard nothing, reinforcing the impression of an ephemeral, almost sentient presence. Parish ledgers and travellers' diaries from centuries past hint at mysterious singing that drifted down from the hills, chronicled as part wonder, part warning, and always inexplicably. One 17th century account described a wandering monk who paused along a fog-laden trail, hearing harmonies that lifted his heart yet sent shivers through his body, attributing them to the forest spirits that were said to inhabit the valley. Another noted, "Voices of the unseen during a harvest evening, recorded as both a marvel and a forewarning of storms to come." These documents suggest that St. Märgen's phenomenon has persisted over centuries, blending the auditory with the legendary in ways that have long fascinated and unsettled listeners. Rounding a bend or stepping into a clearing, newcomers to the area often hear a sudden, ethereal harmony that leaves them questioning whether it is real or imagined. One tourist recounted standing on a narrow trail above a stream when a series of harmonized tones swirled around him, moving with apparent directionality, fading when he tried to locate the source. Another described hearing multiple voices layered like instruments, with some high-pitched and ethereal, others deep and resonant, the effect amplified by the steep-sided valleys of St. Märgen. Across accounts, the sounds defy expectation, appearing and vanishing without pattern, and leaving a lingering sense that the forest itself is alive in an unseen, sonorous way. Some have suggested that the delicate layering of bird calls, rustling trees, and shifting winds could produce fleeting moments of apparent orchestration, though such occurrences rarely align with witness consistency. Certain raptors, songbirds, and nocturnal species in the Black Forest are capable of complex calls, yet none match the tonal qualities reported. Researchers also considered distant farm or church bells, but those sounds are limited in range and clarity, failing to account for the choir's apparent movement through the valley. Even the most elaborate natural explanations falter when confronted with synchronized harmonics and sudden pauses, leaving the phenomenon scientifically plausible yet fundamentally unresolved. Legends whisper of spirits inhabiting the heights above St. Märgen, voices of monks lost to time, or forest guardians whose songs emerge only when the boundaries between night and day are thin. Folklorists note that the village's location, nestled among deep ravines and peaks, has historically inspired stories of supernatural vigilance. Some accounts describe voices rising in response to travellers' fears or intentions, suggesting an almost interactive presence. While unverifiable, these stories enrich the auditory mystery, offering both cultural context and a sense of continuity that ties the modern phenomenon to centuries of human experience in the forest. With modern observation and recording tools, the choir's mid-phrase disappearance continues to baffle hikers and researchers, leaving only lingering echoes and a sense of being watched. One recent observer described stepping off the trail for a moment of quiet reflection, hearing a swell of harmonized notes that dissipated when he attempted to track their origin, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat and the whisper of wind through the firs. Despite advanced technology and detailed monitoring, the St. Märgen distant choir persists as a riddle, its presence felt more often than it can be documented, a haunting testament to the forest's elusive mysteries. As the wind carries faint notes through the valley at dusk, it is impossible to discern whether the forest itself sings, or if something unseen has chosen to speak. The disoriented soldiers of Staufen. The regiment entered the shadowed Staufen woods under a grey dawn, their boots sinking into frost-hardened soil, unaware that the forest itself would soon bend perception and time. Dense firs and steep ravines framed their path, creating corridors that echoed even the faintest sounds. Historical maps indicated a straightforward route along ridges to reach their temporary encampment, but the early chill carried a damp stillness that seemed to absorb direction. It was here, in this corner of the Black Forest, that the first reports of soldiers becoming hopelessly disoriented would take root, and the valley's quiet power began its subtle work. Within the first hour, familiar landmarks seemed to shift, trees appearing closer or farther than memory dictated, and the usual compass bearings wavered inexplicably. A cluster of ancient beeches, once a clear marker along the ridge, seemed to vanish behind mist that rolled in faster than anyone could predict. Men called to one another, voices slightly distorted, echoing against the slopes in ways that challenged spatial perception. Despite prior training in forest navigation, the unit began to sense a disquieting pattern. No matter which way they moved, the terrain refused to align with their expectations. Whispers of wind through the conifers carried sounds that resembled footsteps, while sunlight fractured through the canopy in odd angles, confusing even the most experienced soldiers. Shimmering light on frost-covered needles appeared as flickers of movement, drawing the men's eyes in multiple directions at once. Birds, normally heard in rhythmic calls, contributed layers of sound that were nearly indistinguishable from human speech. Each natural detail, though ordinary in isolation, compounded to create a sensory environment that defied normal interpretation and magnified every uncertainty. Some soldiers began to notice the undergrowth behaving oddly, with broken branches arranged in patterns that resembled footprints, yet did not match any known boot size or formation. Trees bent at impossible angles, as if leaning toward certain paths, while moss-covered rocks glimmered faintly in the half-light, creating illusions of distant markers. Historical records of the area note that Staufen's ravines have pockets of magnetic anomalies, sometimes affecting compasses and metal instruments, a fact that likely contributed to the soldiers' growing confusion. Small streams wound unpredictably through ravines, altering the sound of their flow depending on slope and foliage, giving the impression of movement in the wrong direction. These natural quirks, combined with unusual echoing effects from the steep slopes, heightened the perception that the forest itself was shaping and guiding their movements. Decisions to veer left or right were made with precision, yet every choice seemed to loop them back toward indistinguishable undergrowth, leaving the unit trapped in a labyrinth of branches and shadows. Trails once clearly marked by brush clearing or natural landmarks seemed to vanish into a tangle or slope. Even the most confident leaders hesitated, consulting maps that refused to correspond to what lay before them. Every attempt to impose order on the path only deepened the sense that the forest had its own agenda, a silent architecture designed to confound intruders. As the hours dragged on, murmurs among the men grew tense. Some claimed glimpses of movement just beyond sight, and the feeling of being watched pressed heavily on their shoulders. One soldier recounted seeing a figure pause atop a distant ridge, only to vanish when observed more closely. Others felt the underbrush shift unnaturally, producing sounds inconsistent with wind or wildlife. Anxiety mounted, and the weight of fatigue combined with uncertainty, leaving even disciplined soldiers questioning their own senses and the reliability of the terrain itself. Repeated attempts to signal headquarters were met with static, and the soldiers' maps, verified before deployment, no longer aligned with the terrain they traversed, intensifying disorientation. Radio equipment produced only faint interference, sometimes punctuated by unintelligible hums or tones. Attempts to orient using sun position were thwarted by the fog and low-hanging clouds. Every method of verification seemed to fail simultaneously, creating an almost tactile sense of isolation, as though the Staufen forest had severed their connection to the outside world. A sudden flare of light between the tree trunks startled several men, and yet no fire, torch or reflection could be found. The phenomenon left them questioning whether the forest itself was alive. Some interpreted it as sunlight catching ice crystals on distant branches, yet the regularity and timing of the glimmer suggested intentionality. Shadows stretched and shortened in patterns inconsistent with any natural light source, leaving witnesses unsettled. Even those most skeptical admitted a profound unease as the phenomenon repeated intermittently over the next hour, defying easy explanation. By dusk, units splintered to follow perceived clearings, and some bivouacked beneath unfamiliar pines, their sense of time and direction dissolving into shadows and cold air. The fog deepened, curling around limbs and trunks, and sounds grew muffled and distorted. Soldiers huddled together, checking watches and compasses that no longer agreed. Some whispered about phantom figures, subtle whispers, and the impression that they were not entirely alone. Hunger, fatigue, and the enigmatic environment coalesced, producing a psychological stress that magnified the forest's inexplicable power over perception. When the regiment was finally located, reports noted inconsistencies in accounts, footprints that led nowhere, and a lingering unease that persisted among both the survivors and local villagers who had witnessed the men's confusion. Official records described the group's disorientation as a result of fog and exhaustion, yet every testimony contained subtle, unsettling details. Voices heard where none should exist, fleeting glimmers of movement in uninhabited clearings, and the unshakable sensation of a forest that observed rather than sheltered. Scholars and locals alike have since debated whether the events were entirely environmental, psychological, or influenced by something unseen within the Staufen Woods. The Staufen Woods, even now, compel those who pass through to speak softly of how every step feels guided and every thought unsettled, as though unseen watchers are ever present. The Hexenloch smoke rings. Long before tourists arrived with cameras and hiking boots, villagers near Hexenloch whispered of curling smoke rings rising from the ravine, appearing with no clear source and vanishing just as mysteriously. Hexenloch itself is a narrow, steep gorge in the heart of the Black Forest, where towering firs and jagged cliffs create a natural amphitheatre for wind and fog. The air often holds a chill even in summer, carrying the faint scent of moss and decaying pine needles, which seems to intensify the visual contrast of smoke or mist against dark rock. It was here that locals first began to report seeing perfectly circular forms drifting silently above mossy ledges, their presence sparking stories that blurred the line between natural phenomenon and enchantment. In the late 1800s, local hunters recorded seeing circular wisps drifting above the mossy crevices, describing them as perfectly formed, rotating silently in the crisp morning air. Some claimed that the rings could suddenly appear in groups or stack atop one another, like fleeting stairways made of vapour. Written notes in village records mentioned the way the smoke seemed to follow the curvature of the gorge, lingering momentarily before fading, as if reluctant to be observed. Witnesses emphasised that there was no fire, chimney, or machinery to account for the rings, making their appearance all the more inexplicable. Geologists and meteorologists later noted that the steep slopes of Hexenloch create microclimates, where cold air settles into the ravine and fog forms intricate patterns over uneven rock surfaces. Temperature inversions are common, and the narrow contours of the gorge can funnel wind in unpredictable ways, generating vortices that may carry mist into circular formations. Some scientists propose that the smoke rings might form through the interaction of thermal currents and rock fissures, releasing warm air pockets, though attempts to replicate the phenomenon under controlled observation have never produced results matching what villagers and hikers described. Stories told around hearths spoke of witches gathering on hidden ledges and conjuring smoke rings that danced above the gorge as a signal or warning to passers-by. In some versions, the rings were believed to carry messages to those brave enough to interpret them, while other accounts claimed that the rings could foretell danger, appearing most frequently when storms approached or travellers wandered too close to forbidden areas. Even into the 20th century, folklore preserved this imagery, intertwining it with the natural environment so that the rings were never just smoke. They were portents, symbols, and an enduring connection between the forest and human imagination. Amateur naturalists attempting to measure the phenomenon reported instruments behaving erratically, with barometers and thermometers producing inconsistent readings during sightings. Compass needles wavered unexpectedly, and attempts to collect samples of the ring's substance proved futile. Any material seemed to evaporate almost instantly. Those who lingered too long in the gorge noted a peculiar dampness in the air, combined with sudden changes in wind patterns that carried sounds of distant water or falling branches in ways that disoriented the observer. These repeated anomalies only deepened the sense that the smoke rings were not purely a product of conventional physics. In certain sections of Hexenloch, researchers found naturally occurring mineral deposits that emit a faint heat in sunlight, subtly shaping the movement of mist above the gorge. These mineral hotspots, including pockets of iron-rich schist and quartz veins, can create small updrafts that twist fog into circular forms, offering a partial explanation for the smoke ring's sudden appearance. Hikers reported that the rings often originate near these locations, rising from fissures in the rock rather than from the ravine floor, and occasionally appearing to pause mid-air as if suspended by invisible currents. Historical sketches from the early 1900s show similar formations in roughly the same spots, suggesting a long-standing connection between geology and the mysterious aerial rings. While this does not fully explain the phenomenon, it provides a subtle scientific anchor that complements the folklore and anecdotal reports, adding a new layer to the forest's enigmatic character. Observers noticed that smoke rings often appear in the late autumn and early winter, when frost glistens on the canopy and sunlight strikes the ravine at low angles, though no precise pattern has ever been confirmed. Some villagers claimed that the rings tend to emerge near the same ledges repeatedly, while others argued that they could materialize anywhere within the gorge, as though following their own secret logic. The interplay between shadow and light in Hexenloch enhances the ethereal quality of the rings, and in certain conditions, multiple rings appear to move in coordinated spirals, vanishing before anyone can approach. People who spent extended hours watching the rings sometimes described disorientation, a sudden chill along the spine, or the feeling of being silently followed by something unseen. One hiker recounted standing near a ledge as a thick ring rolled past eye level, and when he stepped forward to inspect it, it dissipated and reformed just behind him, giving the impression that the smoke anticipated his movement. Others noted brief auditory illusions, a soft hiss or whisper coinciding with the ring's passage, adding an unnerving, almost sentient quality to an otherwise silent spectacle. Photographers and hikers tried using long exposures and drones to record the rings, but images often came out blurred or warped, as though the smoke itself resisted being contained by lenses. Videos sometimes captured only faint distortions, a shimmering haze rather than the well-defined circles witnessed by the human eye. Some researchers speculated that the ring's rapid formation and dissipation, combined with localized wind currents, prevent accurate visual capture, yet others proposed more mysterious explanations, suggesting that the gorge somehow alters perception itself during these events. At present, the smoke rings are woven into Hexenloch's identity, inspiring artwork, festivals and folklore tours that celebrate the elusive spectacle while acknowledging that its true nature remains unknown. Local guides caution visitors that the rings cannot be summoned or predicted, only observed, and many recount the mix of wonder and unease experienced by those fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, enough to witness them firsthand. The phenomenon has become both a cultural attraction and a lingering mystery, drawing curiosity seekers while preserving an aura of secrecy around the gorge. During the brightest hours of the day, smoke rings can emerge without notice, fading moments later and leaving the forest still while witnesses wonder if it was real. The unclaimed screams of Titi. The placid waters of Titi, a glacial lake cradled deep within the southern reaches of the Black Forest, are known for their dark, reflective stillness and the quiet charm of the surrounding fir and spruce. Yet for decades, locals and seasonal visitors alike have whispered about an unnerving phenomenon that interrupts this serene landscape. The sudden, inexplicable screams that seem to rise from the lake itself. Night fishermen, who often cast lines into the mirror-like waters well past sunset, have reported hearing sharp, anguished cries echo across the surface, carrying far into the surrounding forest. What unsettles those who hear it is not simply the volume or clarity of the scream, but the impossibility of its origin. No boats ply the waters at these hours, no swimmers stir the lake, and even in the stillest conditions, the sound seems entirely untethered to any natural source. These nocturnal visitors describe the noise as hauntingly human, a piercing yell that fractures the calm with a clarity that makes it almost tangible. Yet, when they attempt to locate its source, the lake offers no clue. Some have scanned the shoreline with flashlights, circled the waters in small boats, and even attempted to record the sound with sensitive audio equipment. But what emerges on playback often confounds expectations. Recordings capture only faint echoes, distorted and occasionally interlaced with a strange, low-frequency hum that seems absent to the human ear during the live event. Local authorities acknowledge the reports but are reluctant to provide explanations. Official statements generally cite wind patterns, distant wildlife, or acoustic distortions caused by the surrounding hills, yet none of these can account for the sheer consistency with which the screams recur, nor the sense of deliberate rhythm that some listeners insist they detect. The geography of Titi itself may amplify the unsettling nature of the phenomenon. The lake stretches nearly 2 kilometers in length and is flanked by forested slopes that rise steeply, creating natural echo chambers. Acoustic experts familiar with the area have theorized that temperature inversions or the dense conifer canopy could carry and distort sounds from distant sources, but even such hypotheses cannot fully reconcile why the cries appear with such specificity at night and vanish entirely by day. One long-standing report comes from a retired innkeeper who maintained a small lodge near the lake's western shore. He claimed that, on multiple nights over several summers, the screams commenced precisely around 11:15 p.m, lasted no more than a few minutes, and then ceased without a trace. Despite the inn's proximity, no guests or staff ever reported seeing movement on the water, and the lake surface remained eerily smooth, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface. Historical records of Titi hint at an older, equally unsettling resonance. The lake has long been associated with local folklore that speaks of spirits bound to the water, a motif common in many alpine and Black Forest traditions. Tales recount lost travellers and fishermen who never returned, whose voices were said to linger above the water, repeating cries of distress. Scholars of regional folklore suggest that such stories could have been amplified over centuries, yet they cannot entirely dismiss contemporary first-hand accounts from those who describe the screams as frighteningly immediate and tangible. In some reports, fishermen have claimed that the cries seemed almost to follow them, shifting in tone and intensity as if aware of their movement across the lake. This sensation of being observed or followed intensifies the psychological weight of the encounter, leaving those present both fearful and deeply unsettled. Scientific attempts to capture and explain the phenomenon have yielded intriguing but inconclusive results. In 1997, a team of researchers from Freiburg University visited the lake armed with directional microphones and thermal imaging equipment. They observed no unusual heat signatures or visible disturbances on the water, yet the recordings produced faint, intermittent frequencies that resembled a human scream. Analysis suggested the sound occurred at a pitch and timbre that could carry unusually far across water on cool, clear nights, but the precise mechanism for its spontaneous appearance remained unexplained. Subsequent visits by amateur paranormal investigators have documented similar patterns, noting a correlation with nights of calm wind and clear skies, though no definitive cause has ever been established. Some theorists have speculated about underwater gas pockets releasing sudden bursts of trapped air or rare atmospheric phenomena, but these remain speculative, unable to fully account for the uncanny timing and unmistakable human quality of the cries. Eyewitness testimonies occasionally describe an accompanying subtle movement across the lake. Some report seeing brief, shadowy ripples, as though something glides just beneath the surface, yet visual evidence is fleeting, often disappearing before cameras can capture it. Others insist on a fleeting silhouette of a figure standing along the far shoreline, always just at the periphery of vision, vanishing whenever approached. Such accounts, combined with the acoustic anomalies, create a layering of mystery that has become a defining characteristic of the Titi phenomenon. Locals speak of it in hushed tones, suggesting that the lake is a place where the boundary between the seen and unseen blurs, and that those who approach with curiosity risk encountering something beyond rational understanding. Psychological effects on witnesses are often pronounced. Individuals recount a lingering sense of dread, as if the lake retains the echoes of unclaimed pain. Night fishermen and campers report disrupted sleep, vivid dreams, and a heightened awareness of the surrounding forest after hearing the screams. While skeptics attribute this to natural anxiety or suggestibility, the uniformity and specificity of multiple independent accounts across decades present a puzzle that challenges purely psychological explanations. Researchers attempting to study the phenomenon scientifically often struggle with its ephemeral nature, finding that a single night of observation can produce compelling auditory anomalies while another night remains perfectly silent. Local initiatives aimed at showcasing the phenomenon to a wider public have sometimes ended in disappointment. Amateur filmmakers equipped with high-sensitivity audio and video devices often encounter the same problem. Recording equipment captures faint distortions and echoes, but fails to definitively reveal a source. One filmmaker described reviewing footage to find that the water appeared entirely placid, the surrounding trees motionless, yet the audio track retained a scream that seemed impossibly clear and nearby. Attempts to replay the experience for outsiders invariably fall short, leaving witnesses to grapple with the tension between personal perception and documented reality. This gap between what is felt and what can be proven only deepens the mystery and the reputation of Titi as a place that resists explanation. Extensive investigation, both scientific and local, has done little to resolve the mystery of the unclaimed screams, which remain a hallmark enigma of the Black Forest. They occupy a peculiar space in regional consciousness. At once a cautionary tale for nighttime wanderers, a subject of folklore, and a genuine anomaly studied by modern acoustics and psychology. Each report contributes to a mosaic of sensation, geography and history, yet none provides closure. Visitors continue to traverse the shores and cast lines into the still waters, fully aware that the lake may call to them in ways they cannot anticipate. When the night is perfectly silent, those who listen closely cannot be certain that the next scream will not come without warning. The Gengenbach clock reset episode. Gengenbach, a quaint town nestled along the Kinzig River in the southern Black Forest, is known for its half-timbered houses, cobblestone streets and quiet mornings that stretch lazily beneath the watchful shadows of ancient church spires. Yet one spring morning in the early 1990s, the village awoke to an inexplicable disruption that would quietly unsettle its residents for years. At precisely dawn, in homes across the town, mechanical clocks, grandfather clocks in parlours, small wall clocks in kitchens, and even battery-powered wristwatches stopped simultaneously, as though some unseen hand had pressed pause on time itself. There was no storm, no recorded power outage, and no shared electrical wiring that could account for the event, leaving the town enveloped in a rare and silent disorientation. Residents were the first to notice the anomaly, some mid-morning as they prepared for work, others in the early hours when the sun first touched the rooftops. One elderly baker recounted standing before his wall clock, watching the second hand frozen in place, while the aroma of fresh bread seemed suspended alongside it. Across the river, a young teacher described the identical moment her wristwatch ceased ticking and her kitchen clock mirrored the frieze, hands locked in an impossible symmetry. Conversations between neighbours revealed a pattern. No single house was affected in isolation. Instead, the phenomenon spanned multiple streets, multiple blocks, suggesting a synchrony that defied ordinary understanding. Mechanical experts who examined the affected clocks noted a striking similarity. The devices were all highly precise instruments, many handcrafted or imported from renowned German clockmakers, yet their failures occurred simultaneously despite differences in design and age. Grandfather clocks that had operated flawlessly for decades were no more reliable than newer quartz models, which also inexplicably halted. For villagers, the event was less a matter of practicality and more a deeply uncanny experience. Life continued outside, roosters crowed, water flowed from taps, birds called from the nearby forest. But inside homes, every traditional measure of time lay suspended, as if the town itself had slipped into a liminal hour beyond comprehension. Experts in physics and horology who later studied the incident considered environmental and atmospheric factors. Gengenbach sits along a narrow valley surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, a landscape capable of generating localized geomagnetic anomalies. While geomagnetic storms can interfere with electronics, they cannot affect purely mechanical devices like pendulum clocks or spring-driven watches. Even so, researchers documented the incident meticulously, noting that the clock's precise synchronization could not be explained by standard models of environmental interference. Electromagnetic measurements taken after the event revealed nothing unusual, leaving the village's chronometry intact in every sense except for that single frozen hour. Local historians, drawn to the region's rich heritage, found only minor precedents in folklore. The Black Forest has long been associated with legends of time spirits, supernatural entities said to slow or reverse the passage of hours for those who enter their domain at the wrong moment. Stories of frozen hours appear in diaries from the 18th century, often describing sudden, inexplicable halts in daily routines that left townspeople disoriented. While such tales may have been shaped by imagination, their persistence in the local consciousness creates an eerie resonance with the 20th century incident, suggesting that Gengenbach's experience fits within a centuries-old pattern of time-related anomalies in the region. Many who were present described the event as having a nuanced yet deeply affecting psychological impact. In one particularly detailed recollection, a schoolteacher described noticing that the second hand of her watch stopped precisely at 6:14 a.m, the same time her kitchen clock froze. She returned to her window, expecting to see the usual morning bustle, but the streets appeared unusually quiet, the birdsong somehow subdued. The suspension of movement in such an ordinary context provoked a creeping sense of unease. Others reported moments of déjà vu, claiming that daily activities felt disjointed, as though the rhythm of the town had temporarily shifted into an unfamiliar cadence. For several days afterward, villagers remained attuned to their clocks, watching for subtle irregularities, hesitant to trust any measure of time without scrutiny. Technical examinations involved thorough wiring checks, dismantling of clocks, and consultations with local electricity companies. None yielded conclusive evidence. Electrical systems were verified as fully functional and no local outages had occurred. Clocks were found to be in perfect working order once restarted, with no damage or tampering. Even with expert analysis, the anomaly remained isolated to that one dawn. Yet the very absence of an explanation only amplified its impact. Residents began speculating quietly about hidden mechanisms, perhaps subterranean streams affecting magnetic fields, rare atmospheric conditions, or even unknown celestial alignments. Though such theories lacked conclusive proof, they offered a framework for attempting to rationalize the unaccountable. The incident's legacy has endured in part because it altered the town's relationship with time. Gengenbach, historically meticulous about routines and festivals, its annual Fastnet Carnival and Christmas market operate with clockwork precision, became subtly haunted by the memory of that frozen dawn. Stories are told with a quiet, lingering tone, describing how even decades later, villagers sometimes glance at a clock and feel a brief pang of doubt, a whisper that time may be less absolute than it appears. Journalists who visited in the years afterward described a town both charming and subtly unsettled, where the ordinary progression of hours seems to carry a faint echo of that inexplicable halt. In attempting to reconcile the event, specialists have emphasized the remarkable combination of ordinary and extraordinary elements. Gengenbach remained otherwise untouched. Daily life continued unabated, and yet in the quiet of homes, clocks stopped with unnerving precision. The anomaly sits at the intersection of human perception, mechanical reality, and the subtle, persistent mysteries embedded in the geography and history of the Black Forest. The 1990s incident, now archived in local newspapers and recorded oral histories, stands as one of the most compelling modern examples of a phenomenon that seems to defy logic while leaving undeniable traces in collective memory. Over the decades, the hands moved once more, yet no one could shake the uneasy thought that Gengenbach had, if only briefly, encountered the inexplicable. The Wolfsschlucht unopened cabin mystery. Deep within Wolfsschlucht, a small cabin stood locked and silent, its weathered timbers hinting at decades of isolation, yet it had never been opened or properly documented, becoming the focal point of a local mystery that has persisted for generations. The structure's roof sagged slightly under years of snow and rain, while the darkened windows reflected only the shifting canopy above. Passers-by often remarked on the unsettling stillness surrounding it. The forest seemed to bend around the cabin, muffling distant sounds and leaving only the occasional crack of a branch to remind visitors they were not alone. Though the valley was frequently traversed by hikers, hunters, and forestry workers, the cabin had remained untouched, as if intentionally preserved by an unseen hand, and it was the secrecy of its interior that most intrigued those who dared to approach. The first person to encounter the cabin in recent years was a forestry ranger conducting routine patrols, who noted the unbroken dust on the windows and the strange absence of footprints leading to its door. The ranger had expected signs of local hikers or wildlife, but there were none. The surrounding undergrowth appeared largely undisturbed, save for the natural patterns of fallen pine needles and moss. He circled the cabin multiple times, inspecting every wall, every corner, yet the structure offered no clues. Even the doorknob, old and corroded, remained firmly in place, and attempts to peer inside through the shutters revealed only shadows and faint outlines of objects that refused clear identification. Archival research revealed that the cabin may have been constructed in the early 20th century, possibly serving as a hunting lodge or forestry observation post, though records of its ownership and purpose were incomplete and contradictory. Some municipal documents listed a small plot of land in Wolfsschlucht, assigned to forestry management, yet no specific reference to a cabin existed. Oral histories described a forester named Jäger, who occasionally worked the valley during the 1920s, but whether he built the cabin or merely used it was unclear. Even historians specializing in Black Forest architecture noted that the style of the structure, simple timber construction with a steep roof and small hearth, matched common designs of the period, yet the total lack of documentation suggested it was deliberately concealed or forgotten. Locals shared tales of hermits and wanderers disappearing near Wolfsschlucht, often linking the unopened cabin to these stories, describing it as a place that seemed to attract or guard those who vanished without explanation. One elderly resident recounted a childhood memory of a man seen entering the forest near the cabin, never to return. Others spoke of travellers who passed through the valley and reported seeing flickers of light within the cabin at night, despite the lack of any recorded occupants. Folklore suggested that the structure was haunted or protected by forest spirits, a notion that inspired both fear and fascination. These stories, while unverifiable, lent a sense of weight to the cabin's mystery, as though generations had quietly acknowledged its singular presence in the valley. Attempts by authorities and curious visitors to enter the cabin consistently failed. Locks were intact, hinges unyielding, and the interior appeared undisturbed, leaving only the faint impressions of past human presence in dust-covered corners and abandoned tools. Metal chains hung inside the doorway, rusted with age but unbroken, while a small pile of wood lay stacked neatly by the hearth. Some attempted to break in or force open the door, yet nothing yielded, as if the cabin itself resisted intrusion. Photographs taken through the windows suggested a simple interior, a table, a few chairs and shelves, but no sign of recent use. The more people tried to understand the cabin's purpose, the deeper its enigma grew. Inside, glimpses through the cracked shutters suggested anomalies. A stack of firewood arranged neatly despite decades of neglect, faint scorch marks on the stone hearth, and the lingering scent of wood smoke that seemed impossibly fresh. Some researchers speculated that the fire had been maintained recently, though no evidence of modern fuel or human presence was ever found. Cobwebs in corners contrasted with the orderly placement of items, adding to the sense that the cabin existed in a temporal limbo, frozen between past and present. Even the furniture seemed to defy explanation. Small scratches and dents suggested use, yet their pattern did not match any known human activity or animal behaviour. Up close, the cabin often exuded an unsettling atmosphere, a tension that made observers uneasy, as if it resisted scrutiny and silently tracked their movements. Visitors described a sense of being observed from within, despite the impossibility of anyone being inside. Some recounted feeling a draft or a subtle vibration through the floorboards when no wind could account for it, and others said that ordinary sounds seemed muted around the cabin, as if the forest absorbed them. This psychological dimension heightened the cabin's mystique, making the unexplained aspects of its interior feel even more ominous and impenetrable. No matter the modern tools brought to bear, photography, documentation, or attempts to open it, the cabin continues to guard its secrets, each new observation deepening the mystery of its origin and sealed state. Surveys using infrared cameras and ground-penetrating radar revealed nothing unusual beneath the structure, and yet, faint traces of footsteps, footprints, or other signs of occupation were repeatedly reported near the thresholds and around the perimeter. Researchers and visitors alike leave the valley with a lingering impression of incompleteness, as though the cabin is a living puzzle designed to be partially seen but never fully understood. At twilight, the cabin in Wolfsschlucht is said to pulse with the forest itself, a silent presence seemingly waiting for a visitor who may never come. The Forbach shadow diver. Something moved too quickly to be human, slipping between the dense fir trunks with a fluidity that defied natural motion, and for a moment the hunters who had paused mid-step could only stare, unsure whether they were witnessing a living being or a trick of shadow and light. This was the Forbach shadow diver, an unexplained presence first reported in the southern Black Forest, when locals described a dark, shapeless figure moving at unnatural speeds through the wooded slopes near the Kinzig River. The anomaly had been partially captured on a shaky home video, a brief glimpse of something that appeared to dissolve and reappear between trees, leaving both witnesses and analysts baffled. The footage, though grainy, lent a disturbing tangibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as imagination. Yet, it revealed nothing concrete, only the impression of movement too swift and silent to fully comprehend. The initial eyewitness accounts were vivid and consistent. Hunters reported seeing a dark form darting through the underbrush, its motion unlike any deer, fox or wild boar native to the Black Forest. One seasoned tracker who had spent decades following trails in the area claimed the figure moved with a deliberate fluidity, almost like it bent the space between the trees. Another described the sensation of being pursued, even when the figure had vanished from view, the shadow seemingly aware of their attention. The witnesses were careful to note that it was not a reflection of moonlight or a trick of their eyes. The shape lacked defined features, yet maintained a consistent size and velocity, weaving through the forest with precision and speed that human or animal beings could not match. The terrain of Forbach further complicates the mystery. The area consists of steep slopes interspersed with dense fir and spruce, creating natural corridors that can conceal movement and distort perception, especially in low light. Observers often describe the forest as an almost claustrophobic space at dusk, where shadows shift unpredictably and every motion is amplified. Yet even accounting for optical illusions, the reports maintain a level of precision that is difficult to dismiss. Several hunters noted that the figure would vanish entirely when approached, as though aware of being observed, slipping silently and effortlessly beyond reach. Examining the home video yielded further observations, but these proved inconclusive and perplexing. The footage, taken with a small handheld camcorder, shows intermittent blurs of dark shapes moving across the frame, sometimes partially obstructed by branches or foliage. Motion blur and low light naturally limit clarity, but experts in video forensics noted that the speed and smoothness of the motion were inconsistent with typical forest animals. Attempts to enhance the footage produced no definitive identification. Some sequences suggested a humanoid outline, while others appeared almost liquid, a shadow that stretched and compressed unnaturally. Though the recording cannot definitively prove the presence of a mysterious entity, it corroborates the eyewitness perception of something moving at impossible speed and with unnatural fluidity. Local folklore adds another layer to the story. The Black Forest has long been home to legends of elusive forest spirits, often called Waldgeister, who slip silently between the trees, sometimes observing humans but rarely interacting directly. Historical accounts collected in regional archives occasionally reference sudden glimpses of dark, fleeting shapes moving at night, with villagers reporting feelings of being watched or followed. While some of these stories are centuries old and largely anecdotal, their persistence suggests a cultural framework that may shape the interpretation of modern sightings, and yet the consistent detail regarding speed, shape, and behaviour of the shadow diver remains striking. The psychological effect on those who encounter the phenomenon is pronounced. Hunters who witnessed the shadow diver often report a lingering sense of disorientation, as though the forest itself had shifted during the encounter. Several noted an intense focus on the direction of movement, only to discover seconds later that the figure had moved a distance impossible for a human or known animal. The brain struggles to reconcile visual information that violates learned expectations, and in a dense, uneven forest, perception can become unreliable. Some residents began avoiding the deeper woods after dark, citing both the fear of encountering the shadow and the uneasy sensation that the trees themselves could harbour movement that defies explanation. Scientific observations attempt to ground the phenomenon in environmental realities. Low light, uneven canopy, and rapid motion can produce optical illusions. Shadows may appear to extend or shift in ways that confuse perception. Motion blur in recordings can exaggerate speed or shape, producing the impression of a fluid humanoid form where none exists. Yet while these factors may account for some aspects of the experience, they cannot fully explain the consistency of eyewitness descriptions, nor the impression of deliberate movement. Unlike Titi, where the mysterious sound could be partially recorded and analysed acoustically, or Gengenbach, where mechanical devices provided tangible but inexplicable evidence, the Forbach shadow diver leaves only ephemeral traces, blurred frames, fleeting glimpses, and an unsettled mind. Repeated sightings suggest the figure may be a persistent presence rather than a random optical anomaly. Hunters returning to the same area have occasionally reported subtle signs: disturbed underbrush, slight depressions in soft soil, or fleeting silhouettes glimpsed out of the corner of the eye. Environmental facts reinforce the plausibility of fleeting misperception. Tall, dense trees cast long shadows, fog collects in low areas, and twilight light changes constantly. Yet the pattern and behaviour of the shadow diver are strikingly specific, lending credibility to multiple independent accounts. Despite repeated attempts to capture more footage or observe the phenomenon under controlled conditions, it remains elusive, a ghostly motion that defies both capture and analysis. The Forbach shadow diver exemplifies a type of mystery deeply rooted in the Black Forest, something that exists at the intersection of perception, environment, and folklore. It eludes explanation not because it is impossible to study, but because it resists the linear expectations of observation and documentation. Each report, each frame of video, each fleeting glimpse contributes to a mosaic of evidence that is tantalizingly specific yet frustratingly incomplete. Scientists, folklorists, and eyewitnesses alike confront a single persistent truth. The forest hides more than it reveals, and the boundary between the natural and the unexplained can be remarkably thin. Between the trunks, the shadow diver slips unseen, faster than the eye can follow, its presence lingering long after the screen goes dark. The Kandel Ridge disappearing lights. They appeared without warning, hovering above the treetops like tiny lanterns released into a cold night sky, drifting slowly along the dark silhouette of Kandel Ridge, with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. The phenomenon became known as the Kandel Ridge disappearing lights, reported repeatedly by forest rangers, hikers and locals who observed them from the valleys below. Witnesses described small points of light, sometimes yellow, sometimes white, that glided over the ridge's forested slopes, vanishing entirely when anyone attempted to approach. Unlike distant vehicle headlights or reflective markers, these lights moved unpredictably, shifting in height and speed with a precision that suggested intent, leaving observers both fascinated and uneasy. The earliest recorded sightings occurred in the late 1970s, though oral accounts hint at earlier observations unrecorded by modern authorities. Rangers patrolling the forest reported first noticing the lights while on routine night shifts, describing how clusters of glowing orbs would appear along the ridgeline before dispersing as they drew near. Hikers ascending the slope at dusk often witnessed the lights moving ahead of them, then disappearing just as they reached the spot where the glow had been. One forestry worker noted that the lights appeared more frequently during misty nights, reflecting faintly on low-hanging fog, but vanishing in clear conditions, as though the atmosphere itself played a role in their concealment. Several intriguing details appear consistently across eyewitness accounts. The lights are rarely more than a few meters apart from one another, yet maintain consistent separation, suggesting a pattern or formation rather than random dispersal. Observers consistently reported that the lights did not emit heat or sound, and attempts to illuminate them with flashlights or spotlights were futile. The beams passed through or around the lights without effect. Some rangers attempted to mark locations with GPS trackers, only to find the lights had shifted when they returned, leaving behind no trace on the forest floor, no scorch marks, footprints, or scorched vegetation. Kandel Ridge itself provides a striking but complex backdrop for the mystery. The ridge stretches over 1,000 meters above sea level, with steep slopes interspersed by dense fir and spruce forests. Cold air settling in the valleys creates temperature inversions, often producing pockets of fog that can refract light. At certain times of year, these conditions could theoretically amplify optical phenomena or reflect distant light sources, yet the reported speed, pattern, and disappearance of the lights defy known atmospheric optical effects. Observers frequently note that the lights seem to anticipate movement, disappearing precisely as an approach is made, a detail that challenges purely environmental explanations. Attempts to record or measure the lights have produced inconsistent results. Amateur photographers captured faint streaks in long exposures, but even the most sophisticated equipment failed to provide clear images. One ranger used binoculars and a portable telescope to track the lights, describing a wavering, almost liquid motion as the orbs moved above the canopy. Atmospheric scientists consulted after these reports noted that while reflection and refraction could account for some visual distortions, they could not explain the apparent vanishing at close range, or the repeated reappearance in patterns that eyewitnesses described consistently over decades. Local folklore adds a layer of historical resonance to the phenomenon. Stories of wandering forest lights, sometimes referred to as Waldgeister or Irrlichter, similar to will-o'-the-wisps, have circulated in the Black Forest for centuries. Folktales describe tiny glowing figures moving between trees, sometimes guiding travellers, sometimes luring them into confusion or danger. Villagers recall elders warning against following unusual lights at night, claiming that the forest itself might be shifting in response. While these accounts are steeped in legend, the repeated modern sightings of Kandel Ridge lights echo many elements of the tales: movement against expectation, unpredictability, and the uneasy feeling of being watched or subtly guided. The psychological impact on witnesses is subtle yet pervasive. Multiple observers report heightened awareness, a sense of slowed time or even vertigo when attempting to follow the lights across the steep terrain. One hiker recounted how his pace quickened involuntarily, yet the light seemed always just out of reach, moving in concert with his motion without any discernible source of propulsion. Even rangers, experienced in night navigation and familiar with wildlife and atmospheric effects, admit to feeling an uncanny sense that the ridge was altered, the space itself behaving differently under the light's influence. These effects contribute to the enduring mystery. While fully observable, the phenomenon resists direct interaction or capture. The lights have prompted investigations that consider both environmental and technological factors as possible explanations. Bioluminescent fungi or insects, distant vehicle headlights, or reflections from small rivers can produce fleeting illuminations in the forest. Rare atmospheric conditions, such as superior mirages caused by temperature gradients, can bend light in unusual ways, creating illusions of floating or moving objects. Yet the collective accounts of the light's behaviour, speed, vanishing at approach, reappearing along the ridge and maintaining precise patterns, defy these conventional explanations. Experts acknowledge that while some sightings may include perceptual artifacts, the consistency across decades and observers points to a phenomenon that cannot be fully dismissed as an illusion. Through the years, the disappearing lights along Kandel Ridge have inspired both intrigue and careful observation. Local guides share the stories with hikers, often emphasizing the rarity of sightings and the difficulty in predicting when or where the lights might appear. Photographs, video clips and sketches circulate in small archives maintained by forestry offices, but no documentation has provided conclusive identification. The lights persist as an enigma, a recurring observable phenomenon that resists capture, defying both technical measurement and straightforward explanation. No amount of study has fully explained the lights, which continue to flit like spectral threads across the Black Forest. They have become part of the local consciousness, a subtle reminder that even familiar landscapes can harbour mysteries. Observers continue to wonder, debate and speculate, yet each sighting reinforces the sense that the forest contains elements that operate beyond ordinary understanding. And though the ridge now sleeps beneath the moonlight, some claim that the light still drifts silently through the treetops, forever, just beyond reach. The Schonach double vanishing. A brief text message arrived on a smartphone in the small village of Schonach, its words ordinary yet chilling. "Someone's following us." It was sent just minutes before two teenagers vanished into the dense forest, never to emerge. This incident, now known as the Schonach double vanishing, remains one of the most confounding mysteries of the Black Forest. A case defined not by sound, light, or anomaly, but by the sudden and absolute absence of two lives within a familiar landscape. The message itself, time-stamped and preserved, became the first and last tangible evidence of their presence, offering only a fleeting window into their final moments. The teenagers had set out on a summer afternoon, intending a short walk along a well-known trail that meandered through fir and spruce stands near the village outskirts. Weather reports from that day indicate clear skies and mild temperatures, with light winds that would carry sound across the valleys but not so far as to interfere with normal hearing. Witnesses in nearby clearings reported seeing the pair walking, backpacks in place, laughing and appearing entirely unaware of any threat. They were last seen at the edge of a shallow ravine, a point where the trail began to curve into denser woodland. Shortly after their departure, the first message was sent. Its sudden tone, alerting that someone was following them, shattered the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. A friend, who received the message moments later, immediately attempted to call them, but the phones went unanswered. Subsequent searches, prompted by the village authorities and local rangers, found the trail undisturbed, backpacks left behind, and no sign of struggle. The contrast between the normalcy of the trail and the urgency of the message intensified the mystery, leaving investigators to wonder if the teenagers had sensed a presence or danger invisible to others. The forest itself complicates any explanation. Schonach consists of dense stands of fir and spruce, interspersed with boggy depressions and rocky outcrops. The undergrowth is thick, and during the summer visibility drops significantly beyond a few dozen meters. Even seasoned hikers find the area disorienting, with trails that curve unexpectedly and elevation changes that make sounds misleading in distance and direction. While natural hazards such as bogs or cliffs might account for accidents, the thorough searches conducted by forest rangers and volunteers revealed no footprints, broken foliage, or evidence of a fall. The terrain, while challenging, left no trace of the missing teenagers, deepening the sense of the forest's impenetrable secrecy. Search operations began within hours of the disappearance. Villagers organised ground teams, while local authorities coordinated with regional search and rescue units. Dogs were deployed to follow scent trails, helicopters scanned the canopy from above, and drones equipped with thermal imaging attempted to detect heat signatures. Despite these extensive efforts, no conclusive trace was found. Investigators documented every detail, including soil disturbance, wind patterns, and temperature variations, all of which provided a factual basis for the search, but did not explain the sudden vanishing. Even areas that would have caused natural obstructions, ravines, streams, bogs, yielded no evidence of a fall or entrapment. The timeline reconstructed from their movements highlights a startling abruptness. Between the last visual confirmation and the final message, only minutes passed. This narrow window of disappearance rules out prolonged wandering, extended accidents, or conventional abduction without immediate traces. Experts in missing person cases note that the speed and thoroughness of searches usually reveal at least minor physical evidence, yet here nothing emerged. The abrupt vanishing, combined with the unexplained message, presents a scenario that resists conventional reasoning. Two people in broad daylight, along a known trail, disappear without a trace or sound. The incident is made all the more unsettling by local tales and superstitions. Tales of wandering spirits, elusive forest guides, and people being led astray by unseen forces have circulated in the Black Forest for centuries. Some stories recount travellers entering familiar paths only to vanish, leaving no trace except their intent to walk home. While such legends do not provide factual explanations, they contextualize the persistent cultural perception that the forest contains hidden spaces beyond ordinary comprehension. In Schonach, these narratives resurfaced immediately after the teenagers' disappearance, reinforcing the sense that the forest might hold elements unseen, or that human perception alone is insufficient to navigate its depths. The psychological impact on the community has been profound. Families, neighbours and hikers report a heightened awareness when entering the forest, a cautious respect that borders on fear. Residents describe returning to the trail and sensing a weight or presence, a subjective experience consistent with the unsettling awareness of unresolved disappearance. Investigators note that cases like the Schonach vanishing create a collective vigilance, reinforcing both caution and the enduring mystery of the event. Even years later, search teams revisiting the area report a sense that the forest preserves its secrets, as if time itself has folded over the path the teenagers took. While the facts provide some framework, they do not lead to a solution. The terrain, weather and daylight were favourable, Technology captured the last known communication. Human observation confirmed their departure. Search teams were thorough and methodical. The absence of any trace, physical, technological, or testimonial, stands in stark contrast to typical forest incidents. While alternative explanations, from accidents to abductions, are explored in official reports, each remains speculative in the absence of evidence. The case continues to challenge both logical reasoning and the assumption that the natural world leaves discernible marks of human passage. The Schonmanzach double vanishing endures as a haunting reminder of the forest's unyielding mysteries. Unlike sound-based anomalies, shadowy figures, or drifting lights, this event underscores a more intimate, disquieting phenomenon. The sudden disappearance of ordinary people under conditions that should have been familiar and safe. Every factual detail, the trail, weather, messages, search efforts, serves to intensify the mystery rather than resolve it. Observers, investigators, and villagers alike remain bound by the certainty of what happened and the uncertainty of how it occurred. Silence returned to the forest, yet the memory of the vanished lives lingers, as if the shadows themselves conceal the truth. The Bad Wildbad ghost radio. It began as a crackle, faint and irregular, emerging from a small portable radio on a campsite nestled in the hills above Bad Wildbad. Campers who had been sharing quiet conversation over the flickering glow of a fire suddenly froze as the device emitted a voice speaking in precise, clipped German, resembling a wartime military broadcast. There was no known station transmitting on that frequency, no scheduled program, and yet the words were clear and structured, punctuated by static that seemed to hum in rhythm with the forest itself. This uncanny phenomenon, now referred to as the Bad Wildbad ghost radio, baffled everyone present, and has since been recounted by locals and visitors alike as an experience that defies technological and historical explanation. The first listeners recall the oddity with a mixture of awe and unease. They described hearing lists of names, coordinates, and coded phrases, all resembling German transmissions from the 1940s, though modern radios should have no means of receiving such signals. One camper noted that the voice spoke with the timbre and authority of a radio announcer, each sentence carefully enunciated, as if intended for a military audience rather than a woodland gathering. Attempts to adjust the frequency, switch devices, or move to other locations in the campsite had no effect. The same transmission persisted, unaffected by distance or equipment changes. Observers documented precise details. The broadcast typically appeared shortly after dusk, when the forest was settling into the quiet of night and lasted in intermittent bursts of a few minutes. The campfire's glow barely illuminated the surrounding fir trees, yet the voice seemed to fill the forest, echoing slightly as though carried by unseen channels. Hikers passing nearby later reported hearing faint echoes of German words, though muffled and distorted, suggesting the anomaly extended beyond the immediate campsite. Meteorological records for the area during such sightings indicate calm winds and moderate humidity, conditions not conducive to unusual signal propagation, yet the broadcast continued to appear. Technical explanations were quickly sought. Modern FM and AM radios in Germany operate within defined frequency bands, and no station was registered to transmit wartime messages decades after the end of World War II. Signal propagation experts explain that atmospheric phenomena, such as tropospheric ducting, can carry radio waves farther than usual, but such effects cannot selectively deliver content, much less produce the coherent phrasing and coded language that eyewitnesses described. Amateur radio operators attempted to triangulate the source using portable receivers, yet no transmission origin could be located and no conventional transmitter showed activity at the relevant time. The historical context of these broadcasts provides further intrigue. During the 1940s, German military units frequently used coded radio messages to coordinate operations, employing precise frequencies and encryption. Some of these transmissions were region-specific, intended to reach isolated outposts hidden within forested terrain, similar to the Black Forest. Locals in Bad Wildbad, aware of this history, have long told stories of voices heard in the woods, often assumed to be echoes or distorted memories of the past. Unlike the ordinary folklore, however, the modern recordings capture the clarity, structure, and content expected of actual wartime broadcasts, blurring the line between legend and technological anomaly. The terrain of Bad Wildbad itself complicates any straightforward explanation. The forested hills, dense fir stands, and steep valleys inhibit conventional radio propagation, making accidental reception of a distant signal improbable. Elevation differences and topographic shadows should create interference, yet the broadcast was heard clearly across multiple positions within the same campsite and along adjacent paths. Scientists and hobbyists visiting the area have consistently confirmed that, under standard conditions, no legitimate source could account for the messages being received in such clarity without line of sight. Folklore adds a layer of cultural resonance. Stories from villagers recount voices heard on cold nights, sometimes issuing warnings or repeating the names of long-gone soldiers, and other times whispering coordinates into the dark. While these tales may be anecdotal, they provide a historical framework for understanding the way locals interpret the ghost radio, as an intersection of human memory, technology, and the persistent echo of events long past. The repeated appearance of wartime-style broadcasts on modern radios aligns uncannily with these older accounts, suggesting that the phenomenon taps into something more than coincidence. Listeners' mental and emotional responses were also recorded during the investigation. Campers reported a sudden stillness, the feeling of being observed, and a heightened awareness of the surrounding forest. Some hesitated to return to the campsite after dark, while others described dreams influenced by the content of the transmissions, recalling the names and phrases heard. Local media coverage, though limited, treated the phenomenon with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, interviewing both residents and visitors who had first-hand experiences. Even those with technical expertise admit to feeling unsettled, as the intersection of clear communication, historical accuracy, and the impossibility of transmission creates a lingering tension. The phenomenon was only partially captured despite repeated recording attempts. Digital recorders captured static-laden clips with recognizable words, yet each time the content varied slightly, as though responding to environmental conditions or the presence of listeners. Experts reviewing these recordings note that they contain characteristics inconsistent with known broadcasting equipment, fluctuations in amplitude, unexplained pauses, and an almost rhythmic cadence in the static that defies standard signal processing patterns. Despite these anomalies, the broadcast retained sufficient structure and content to suggest intentionality rather than random noise. The Bad Wildbad ghost radio, therefore, exists at the intersection of fact and enigma. Historical broadcasts did exist, local topography allows for unusual propagation effects, and modern devices should be incapable of receiving signals from decades-old sources. Yet eyewitness accounts, partial recordings, and the uncanny precision of the transmissions resist rational explanation. Even repeated observation has failed to produce any predictable pattern or method of reception, leaving the phenomenon as both a technological curiosity and a haunting reminder that the past can intrude into the present in ways the mind struggles to reconcile. After the silence of the radios, the hills of Bad Wildbad are rumoured to carry the voices of the past to anyone who will listen. The unseen footsteps of the Schramberg mines. The shafts of the Schramberg mines are silent now, yet the memory of sound lingers in the minds of those who once descended into their depths. It was here, amid the narrow, timbered corridors and damp limestone walls, that workers and explorers alike reported hearing footsteps that had no source, a phenomenon now referred to as the unseen footsteps of the Schramberg mines. These sounds were heard at regular intervals, echoing through abandoned shafts, stopping abruptly whenever someone attempted to locate their origin. The first accounts, logged by miners in the 1960s, describe a rhythmic cadence, heavy, deliberate, yet impossible to trace, resonating as though someone walked behind every corner, yet no one was there. The mines themselves are centuries old, carved into the hills surrounding Schramberg in the central Black Forest. Originally developed to extract iron and other minerals, the shafts extend for kilometres beneath dense forest canopies, their layouts mapped in meticulous, if now partially decayed records. Wooden supports, prone to creaking under the slightest movement or change in air pressure, line many corridors, adding a natural acoustic element to the environment. However, the consistency of the phantom footsteps defies ordinary structural explanations. Experienced miners, familiar with every echo and groan of the tunnels, confirmed that the sounds could not be attributed to shifting timber or settling stone. Explorers and researchers who later ventured into the abandoned sections described an unsettling dissonance between sound and space. Footsteps seemed to move against the gradient of the tunnels, sometimes travelling uphill, sometimes echoing from side passages that led nowhere. Observers noted that the sound had a distinct weight and cadence, far heavier than the patter of small animals, and often maintained a tempo over several minutes before vanishing without warning. One record from a 1982 exploration described footsteps approaching from a dead-end tunnel and halting precisely at the point where a wall met the ceiling, leaving the team frozen in both awe and apprehension. Acoustic experts consulted on the phenomenon acknowledge that underground environments can amplify and distort sounds, creating the illusion of movement. Resonance in long shafts can carry minor vibrations for hundreds of meters, while variations in rock density and tunnel shape produce echoes that appear to originate elsewhere. Yet the reported regularity of the footsteps, often appearing at intervals matching human gait, and the abrupt cessation when approached, does not conform to known acoustic behaviour. Even using modern recording equipment, teams have been able to capture the sounds clearly, but the recordings fail to reveal a source. No mechanical, animal, or human origin has ever been confirmed. Historical records suggest that the mines were hazardous long before the reports of unexplained footsteps. Accidents, collapses, and occasional fatalities left an imprint of caution and superstition among miners. Local folklore speaks of spirits that wander the shafts, either protective entities of miners lost long ago, or presences tied to the earth itself. Some accounts from the early 20th century describe tools moving without explanation and lanterns swinging despite calm air. While anecdotal, these reports form a context in which the modern accounts of footsteps resonate, a blend of human psychology and environmental uncertainty. Investigations into the shafts have included meticulous mapping, acoustic monitoring, and repeated site visits. Sensors placed along corridors detect vibrations caused by temperature changes, rock settling, and human movement, but none correspond to the phantom footsteps. Attempts to provoke the sounds by entering or leaving the tunnels at expected intervals have produced inconsistent results. Sometimes the footsteps manifest exactly as reported, sometimes they do not appear at all. Researchers note that the unpredictability of the phenomenon intensifies its psychological impact, making those inside the tunnels hyper-aware of every creak, echo, and drip. The forest above, while quiet, contributes indirectly to the mystery. Shifts in temperature between the surface and the subterranean tunnels can cause micro-movements in stone and timber, creating faint noises that might mimic footsteps. Yet explorers report that the perceived location of the sounds rarely aligns with structural anomalies. Moreover, the sounds maintain a rhythm and tone reminiscent of deliberate human movement, rather than random environmental noise. This uncanny precision, set against the labyrinthine and oppressive environment of the mines, gives the footsteps an almost sentient quality. Eyewitness accounts consistently highlight the psychological dimension. Individuals report a sense of being followed, a rising tension as echoes converge and recede around them. Some describe imagining figures rounding corners, only to find empty corridors. Extended exposure can induce disorientation, fatigue, and heightened anxiety, reinforcing the perception that the sounds are deliberately avoiding detection. Unlike phenomena above ground, the enclosed echoing spaces of the mine amplify every step, imagined or real, turning the simplest acoustic anomaly into a deeply immersive and unnerving experience. Repeated inquiries have done little to clarify the phenomenon, as the footsteps in the Schramberg mines persist without attribution. Experts acknowledge the plausible role of acoustic anomalies, but cannot account for the precision, timing, and human-like cadence consistently reported. The phenomenon persists as an intersection of human perception, subterranean architecture, and unexplained occurrence, resisting conventional reasoning even as factual details about the mines, their layout, history, and environmental conditions provide a rich framework for investigation. Those who enter the shafts today do so with caution, aware that the footsteps, if they appear, will defy logic and evade capture. Each recorded instance, each careful observation, only deepens the mystery, blending the tangible facts of mining history and architecture with the intangible ghostly presence of sound. For the Black Forest, this is another reminder that even centuries-old industrial spaces are not immune to the forest's ability to conceal and confound. The darkness of Schramberg's shafts is quiet once more, but the phantom echo of footsteps continues to shadow the brave. The Gutach Phantom Train Horn. The sound came without warning, cutting through the quiet of the Gutach valleys like a summons from another era. Villagers recall standing in the misty morning air or the stillness of twilight, when the unmistakable wail of a train horn echoed across the forested slopes long after the tracks had been removed. This phenomenon, now known as the Gutach Phantom Train Horn, has puzzled residents, historians, and acoustic specialists alike. The horn's tone was deep, commanding, and unmistakably mechanical, yet the rail lines it once served had been dismantled decades before, leaving only the rolling hills and dense firs of the Black Forest to carry the sound. The experience is reported by witnesses as both mesmerising and unsettling. Farmers tending early crops spoke of the horn reverberating through valleys, seeming to approach from multiple directions, then fading into the fog. Hikers on trails that follow old railway paths reported a similar impression. The horn's sound was vivid and immediate, as though a train had appeared out of time. Some even claimed that the echoes seemed synchronised with moments of sudden stillness in the forest, as if the valley itself were responding to the call. Despite attempts to rationalise the experience, no source has ever been found, and the phenomenon continues to inspire both fascination and fear. The history of Gutach's railways provides a tangible framework for understanding the mystery. The line, constructed in the late 19th century, connected small industrial towns and was used primarily for freight, including timber and iron. Steam locomotives carried distinctive horns meant to alert pedestrians and animals in valleys and forested areas. By the mid-20th century, these lines were dismantled or fell into disuse, replaced by road transport. Detailed maps and archival records confirm the absence of any operational trains in the region, and yet the horn persists as if carried across time itself. Topography plays a crucial role in how the sound is perceived. The valleys of Gutach are narrow and steep, lined with dense fir forests that can channel and amplify sound. Echoes produced in such terrain can travel for kilometres under the right conditions, occasionally giving the impression of movement or multiple sources. Acousticians note that temperature inversions, common in the Black Forest at dawn and dusk, can bend sound waves, causing noises from distant sources to appear unusually close. Yet experts consistently emphasise that while these factors can explain amplification or distortion, they cannot account for the horn's clarity, cadence, and timing, especially when no mechanical source exists.
No.
Residents often report that the horn is most likely to appear during calm, clear conditions, when no other ambient noises interfere with perception. One account describes a father and daughter walking a ridge as the fog lifted. The horn blared, startling them into silence. Yet when they descended to the old track bed, not a single rail or mechanical artefact remained. Another villager recounted hearing the horn while fishing along a tributary, its resonance so strong it felt as though the train had emerged from the depths of the forest itself. Each report adds layers of intrigue, highlighting a phenomenon that intersects memory, expectation, and acoustic reality. Local folklore has long whispered of ghostly trains and spectral conductors wandering the Black Forest. Tales often speak of lost workers or travellers whose spirits return to complete journeys interrupted by accident or misfortune. While such stories are difficult to verify, they provide a cultural lens through which the phenomenon is understood. Even skeptics acknowledge the coincidence between historical railway activity and the specific tonal qualities of the phantom horn, lending the reports an eerie plausibility that blends history with the unexplained. Attempts to document or analyse the horn have met with limited success. Researchers have deployed sensitive microphones, recording devices, and spectrum analyzers to capture the sound, often confirming its presence but failing to trace it to any active source. Acoustic measurements show unusual propagation patterns, with the horn appearing louder at certain elevations or along specific slopes, then disappearing entirely when approached. The consistency of these recordings, paired with the impossibility of any contemporary train operating in the area, leaves a chilling ambiguity that has resisted scientific explanation. Meteorological factors are sometimes invoked to explain the phenomenon. Temperature gradients, wind direction, and air density can affect sound propagation in valleys, occasionally producing illusions of movement or distortion. However, the clarity and tonal accuracy of the horn in multiple reports exceed what could be expected from ordinary echoing or mirage-like effects. In combination with the historical precision of the sound, matching the style of steam-era locomotives, these factors create a paradox in which both physical and historical logic point to plausible explanations that ultimately fall short. Psychological effects on those who experience the phantom horn are profound. Witnesses often describe a sudden stillness in the forest, a heightened awareness of their surroundings, and a lingering sense that something impossible has occurred. Some villagers have adapted routines to avoid the times when the horn is most frequently heard, while others recount dreams in which the train continues its route through valleys long since reclaimed by nature. The cumulative effect reinforces a collective consciousness in Gutach, where the horn has become a symbol of unresolved history, the persistence of memory, and the uncanny persistence of sound in a place that should have been silent. The Gutach phantom train horn continues to sound without attribution, baffling observers and investigators alike. Its presence unites elements of geography, history, and perception into a single, haunting experience that refuses to be explained fully. Each new report, each startled listener, adds to the ongoing mystery, blurring the line between natural phenomena and what might be considered spectral or anomalous. For the valleys of the Black Forest, the horn serves as a reminder that even after infrastructure is gone, the echoes of the past may linger, defying time and expectation. And though the rails have long vanished, the haunting call of the Gutach horn still travels through the valleys, daring anyone to trace it to its source. The Lost Falconer of Kaltenbronn. A lone falcon wheeled silently above the mist-laden bogs of Kaltenbronn, its sharp cry slicing through the chill morning air. Locals have come to call it the first clue of the Lost Falconer, a man who vanished without a trace while tending his bird in the dense moorlands. The bird returned with unerring precision to the same section of bog where the falconer had last been seen, circling repeatedly, dropping small items of its own and calling as if signalling something invisible to human eyes. Though trained to hunt and navigate, its behaviour that day suggested an awareness beyond instinct, a silent testimony to a disappearance that continues to baffle the region. The falconer's movements before vanishing are recounted by eyewitnesses with both precision and unease. Hunters in the surrounding woods described him walking toward the central bog at dawn, his bird perched lightly on his gloved arm, when he paused and looked sharply to the north, then stepped into the fog. Moments later, the falcon broke into sudden flight, returning to the edge of the bog with frantic calls. Another witness, passing along a nearby ridge, noted a flicker of movement in the reeds, then nothing, no sign of the falconer, and no human tracks leading away from the area. Despite multiple attempts to retrace his steps, search parties found only the bird and the untouched landscape, the bog surface reflecting the pale sky, unbroken and impenetrable. The Kaltenbronn moorlands themselves form a labyrinthine terrain that challenges both man and machine. Expansive peat bogs, interspersed with dense pine groves and low ridges, make it easy to become disoriented. Weather shifts rapidly, fog rolling in from neighbouring valleys or clouds settling over the treetops, reducing visibility to mere meters. Navigating these areas requires experience and careful observation, yet even seasoned hunters and forest workers admitted that the moors could swallow a person whole, leaving only subtle hints of passage, disturbed reeds, flattened moss, or fleeting ripples on a bog surface. In this natural complexity, the falcon's repeated returns to a precise location stood out as a startling anomaly. Search parties organised over several days employed tracking dogs, compasses, and careful mapping of the moorlands. Each time the searchers approached the spot indicated by the bird, they found nothing but soft peat, scattered reeds, and the occasional feather. The falcon, undeterred, would leave, circle overhead, and return, repeating the pattern as though guiding the observers towards something beyond comprehension. Helicopters flew above the mist-shrouded terrain, but from that vantage no footprints or disturbance were visible. From below, the fog obscured every path and ridge. The behaviour of the bird became the most reliable and unnerving marker of the falconer's final location. Observations of the falcon's behaviour reveal a mix of instinct and trained precision. Falcons are known for their keen eyesight, rapid decision-making in flight, and strong homing instincts. They can navigate using landmarks, topographic cues, and subtle atmospheric changes. Yet the bird's repeated flights to the bog, hovering over precisely the same spot, and calling with intensity far beyond normal hunting patterns, suggests that it sensed something absent to human perception. Ornithologists consulted on the case confirmed that while a trained falcon may return to a familiar perch, it would not typically exhibit the prolonged, repeated focus displayed here, especially without the falconer present. The event takes on an eerie dimension when viewed through the lens of local folklore. Tales of the Kaltenbronn bogs describe spirits or entities that claim those who wander too far from the safe paths, often leaving animals or guides to signal the disappearance. Historical records hint at similar incidents. Shepherds, hunters, and foresters occasionally vanished in bogs or remote forest ridges, sometimes with their dogs or birds returning alone, circling or remaining near the vanished person's last position. While these stories are difficult to verify, they offer a lens through which the modern incident can be viewed, an intersection of human loss, animal behaviour, and the unknowable reaches of the forest. The psychological impact on those involved was profound. Searchers reported an increasing sense of unease as the bird repeated its pattern, the silence of the moors amplifying every small sound. Observers felt as if the falcon were communicating not just its location but a warning, to respect the forest's hold, to acknowledge that some knowledge remains inaccessible. Family members of the falconer described anxiety and hope intertwined, clinging to the behaviour of the bird as a bridge between the seen and the unseen, between the living and the vanished. The repeated circling became a ritual of memory, a signal of both guidance and mourning. Years passed, and the incident left questions unanswered. Modern attempts to replicate the phenomenon by releasing trained falcons in the same area failed to produce the same persistent pattern. Drone cameras and tracking devices can follow the birds, yet they find no trace of the human the falcon once accompanied. Experts in wildlife behaviour, geography, and psychology agree that while the bird's natural skills explain some aspects, the combination of precision, repetition, and timing remains inexplicable. The Kaltenbronn moorlands, already a site of treacherous beauty, retain their secrets beneath the fog, watched over by a solitary falcon whose loyalty surpasses comprehension. For the Black Forest, the lost falconer is a reminder that even familiar landscapes can conceal profound mysteries. Where human presence disappears, yet animal instinct preserves the memory of what occurred. The bog, the reeds, the flight of a bird all become markers of absence and silent testimony. Each observer, each retracing of the bird's flight, only deepens the tension between what is seen and what is impossible to reconcile. Circling silently above the Kaltenbronn bog, the falcon hovers over the vanished man's last location, guarding a secret the forest keeps. The disappearance in the Glaswald forest. The camera was found lying on a moss-covered log at the edge of Glaswald forest, its strap frayed and lens still faintly warm, as though it had been set down moments before. Inside, the memory card held dozens of images, photographs of ordinary wildlife, filtered sunlight through dense firs, and then streaks of pale light that bent unnaturally across the frames, blurring into forms impossible to identify. These were the last traces of the photographer who had ventured into the forest for a routine scouting trip, only to vanish without a sound. The images themselves suggested motion, presence, and yet absence, a visual paradox that confounded investigators and locals alike, and quickly made the Glaswald disappearance one of the most unsettling mysteries in the Black Forest. Rangers and hikers in the area provided fragmentary recollections. One deer hunter claimed to have glimpsed a figure moving unusually quickly between the trees that morning, too swift and fluid to match a human gait. Another witness remembered seeing flashes of reflected light in the undergrowth, too erratic to be the sun, too precise to be random. Though no one saw the moment of disappearance directly, these observations coincided with the location where the camera was later recovered, suggesting that the forest itself had swallowed the photographer whole, or at least concealed the evidence of his passage. Glaswald Forest is a tangle of dense pines, low-lying clearings, and subtle depressions in the earth that accumulate fog and shadow, even on clear days. Its terrain includes hidden streams, moss-covered boulders, and uneven soil that can easily obscure footprints or other signs of human movement. Scientific surveys of the area confirm that visibility in certain sectors rarely exceeds 20 meters, and the forest floor is littered with fallen branches, roots, and vegetation that make navigation treacherous. The conditions explain why even experienced rangers struggled to locate the photographer, Yet they do not account for the photographic anomalies that recorded something beyond the ordinary. When the recovered camera was examined, technical specialists noted that the shutter speed, exposure and ISO settings were entirely consistent with normal wildlife photography. Yet the streaks of light, some spanning entire frames, could not be reproduced under similar conditions. Experts considered long exposure motion blur, lens flare, or reflections from metallic objects, but each explanation fell short. Certain images appeared to capture forms that shifted shape between frames, as if moving independently of any visible source. The forest, already a place where sunlight fractured into countless beams, seemed to have distorted reality itself in a manner that conventional optics could not fully explain. Search parties scoured the surrounding area, using thermal imaging, infrared cameras, and even drone surveys. Each time they approached the locations indicated by the light streaks in the photographs, they found only the familiar contours of Glaswald, fallen logs, uneven moss, and scattered wildlife. No tracks, no disturbed foliage beyond what nature had laid down, and no trace of the photographer's presence. The drones captured images that echoed the forest's own complexity. Shadows bending into shapes that hinted at movement, yet no human figure appeared. The forest appeared alive, aware, and indifferent simultaneously. Reconstructing the photographer's path depended largely on analysing the images themselves. Investigators marked each point where light anomalies had appeared, mapping them against topographic features and tree cover. Patterns emerged that suggested the photographer had moved in arcs around specific clearings, yet when the team physically traced these paths, the distances, bends and visibility made such precise movement nearly impossible under normal human conditions. It was as if the photographs captured an alternate layer of the forest, one that existed parallel to the observable terrain, recording a journey that no one could follow or verify. Historical context adds another layer of unease. Glaswald has long been associated with disappearances, particularly during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when travellers and hunters occasionally vanished with no trace. Folklore speaks of wandering lights that mislead the unwary, of hidden clearings that shift position, and of spirits that claim those who linger too long. While such stories are often dismissed as superstition, their occurrence aligns uncomfortably with the photographic evidence. Small, inexplicable lights that seem to interact with human movement, leading to disappearance rather than guiding the observer safely through the forest. Viewers of the photographs often experience a powerful psychological effect. Observers report vertigo or a subtle unease when studying the streaks of light, a sense that the forest is watching them as well. Experts in perception note that even seasoned investigators struggle to pass the images without feeling disoriented, as if their own sense of space has been subtly altered. The photographer's family describes an almost obsessive interest in the camera, poring over the frames for hours in search of clues that never appear. Every image becomes both evidence and enigma, tangible proof of something real yet wholly incomprehensible. In the end, the Glaswald disappearance challenges the boundaries of explanation. The forest remains a living, breathing entity, its shadows deep and its light fragmented into impossible forms. Technology, human observation, and environmental familiarity fail to account for the vanishing of one man whose last traces exist only in blurred photographs. Each attempt to rationalize the event seems to fracture further under scrutiny, leaving only the certainty that something profound and invisible occurred, witnessed not by human eyes but captured in a medium that should have been familiar and mundane. The recovered photographs catch streaks of light in the dim forest office, and though Glaswald lies empty, something unseen seems to watch. The dead-end trail of Badenweiler. Hikers following the well-marked trail in Badenweiler's forest expected a routine walk through shaded pines and moss-laden paths, yet their journey took an impossible turn. According to maps and official guides, the trail continued in gentle curves along the hillside, but as they rounded a familiar bend, the path abruptly ended at a sheer drop, a cliff face unmentioned in any guidebook. Confusion rippled through the group as they peered over the edge, finding only jagged rock and dense undergrowth below. Compass readings and GPS devices confirmed that the trail should extend uninterrupted, yet the landscape defied both logic and expectation, leaving the hikers trapped between reason and the forest's subtle, unnerving manipulation. Eyewitness accounts described the moments following the discovery with a mixture of disbelief and fear. One hiker recalled stepping cautiously forward, expecting to find the trail curving around a ridge, only to feel the ground vanish beneath his boots. Another tried to retrace their steps, noticing how familiar markers had shifted or disappeared entirely, leaving the group unable to reconstruct their approach. The forest itself seemed to bend perception, with shadows stretching unnaturally across tree trunks and light filtering in narrow, irregular beams that distorted distance and depth. Even seasoned forest visitors reported a creeping sense of vertigo, as if the terrain had been subtly altered while they were unobserved. The Badenweiler region is known for its undulating hills and dense mixed forests, punctuated by occasional clearings and rocky outcrops. Historical surveys detail well-maintained hiking trails that link valley paths with higher elevations, typically marked by painted posts or cairns. Seasonal fog frequently settles in the lower gullies, reducing visibility, and the forest floor is thick with fallen leaves, moss and roots, creating treacherous footing. Yet while these conditions explain minor disorientation, they do not account for the complete disappearance of a trail or the sudden appearance of a sheer drop where none should exist. The hiker's experience suggested that something beyond ordinary geography was at play. Rangers and forest officials arrived to investigate, bringing maps, survey instruments and modern GPS devices. They traced the trail from the valley, noting the documented markers and cross-referencing official records, but the path repeatedly contradicted its own documentation. At points where maps indicated a gentle curve, the hikers encountered abrupt dead ends. Sections that should have looped around small ridges instead led to dense undergrowth with no discernible exit. Compass bearings that should have guided them around obstacles proved unreliable in the forest's maze-like terrain. Even with careful measurement and triangulation, no rational explanation emerged for the trail's anomalous behaviour. Linking these experiences to historical events exposed a pattern both strange and unsettling. Local lore recounts travellers and hunters who wandered off established paths only to re-emerge hours or days later, often unable to explain the route they had taken or the sudden appearance of certain landmarks. Some older tales speak of forest spirits or guardians, not malevolent but indifferent to human understanding, who rearrange paths or conceal passages from those who wander too far. Historical incidents in Badenweiler and neighbouring Black Forest regions occasionally mention lost trails or disappearing paths, suggesting that the phenomenon has been occurring for centuries, though documentation remains fragmentary. An instant and lasting psychological effect gripped the hikers as they emerged. Many reported a profound sense of temporal distortion, feeling that hours passed in moments or that steps taken carried them further or shorter distances than expected. Anxiety and hyper-awareness heightened every sound. A snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, even distant bird calls felt amplified and imbued with significance. Forest guides emphasised that the combination of steep gradients, visual obstruction, and psychological tension could create minor perceptual errors, yet no explanation accounted for the complete spatial contradiction they had encountered. Even after retracing their steps and descending the slopes back toward the valley, the hikers could not shake the feeling that the forest itself had shifted. Maps appeared inconsistent with the terrain, trail markers seemed new or missing, and the cliff that had ended the path existed only as a fleeting, immutable presence in memory. Attempts to photograph the location revealed no visual clue beyond normal forest elements: pines, moss, undergrowth, and rock. Yet those who had been there swore that the path ended abruptly, and the trail's disappearance remained imprinted on their minds as vividly as if recorded in stone. The dead-end trail of Badenweiler remains one of the Black Forest's most perplexing mysteries, a rare instance where human logic and documented geography collide with unexplainable experience. The forest conceals its methods, leaving only a handful of first-hand accounts, maps that fail to correspond to the land, and a lingering sense of disorientation for those who walk its shaded paths. Each step taken along the trail becomes a negotiation between trust in documentation and the forest's silent, persistent unpredictability. The trail behind the hikers seemed to dissolve as they emerged, replaced by a slope untouched and unknown to all maps. The Schauinsland unidentified wreckage. The storm struck Schauinsland with sudden ferocity, whipping the pine trees into violent arcs and sending torrents of rain cascading down the mountainside. Villagers huddled in their homes, listening as thunder ricocheted through valleys and loose rocks skittered across trails. When dawn broke, the forest seemed strangely quiet, the remnants of the storm leaving the ground littered with broken branches, torn leaves, and scattered debris. Amid this chaos, a few hikers who ventured onto the higher slopes noticed a strange glint reflecting off the wet undergrowth. Small fragments of metal that had not been there the day before. The first fragment was a jagged sheet darker than any local rock and colder than the air around it. Its edges were sharp yet impossibly smooth in places, with faint irregular markings etched into the surface. Nearby, another piece resembled a flattened cylinder, seemingly lightweight despite its solid appearance. Observers bent to touch them, feeling textures unlike any metal familiar to the region, surfaces that hummed faintly when sunlight struck at a certain angle. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath as they gathered around, the wind shifting momentarily to obscure sounds and rearrange the fallen debris as if to conceal it. Over the next hours, the fragments multiplied in the eyes of those watching. Each new piece seemed freshly exposed, pushed from the earth or brought down by the storm's fury. Hikers, locals, and even a few rangers returned in staggered intervals, documenting the fragments, yet each encounter yielded slight differences. A shard previously at the trail's edge might have moved 50 meters downhill, another disappeared entirely. Attempts to measure or lift the heavier pieces revealed nothing unusual physically, yet their transitory presence left a growing unease. The fragments were tangible yet fleeting, refusing permanence in a way that unsettled all who approached. Scrutiny revealed nothing comprehensible. The items defied understanding at every turn. Small scientific teams arrived with portable kits, testing for alloy composition and corrosion patterns. The results suggested materials unlike any documented in European manufacturing, a mix of metals resistant to oxidation and unusually malleable for their density. Attempts to trace them to past aviation incidents, meteorological events, or wartime debris were fruitless. No plane had been reported missing over Schauinsland, no satellite records indicated a crash, and no industrial operation nearby could account for the materials. Even the patterns on the fragments resisted conventional interpretation, resembling neither human design nor natural erosion. As days passed, local memory and history threaded through the narrative of discovery. Older villagers spoke of times when the mountain gave up strange objects after heavy storms, though most dismissed these stories as anecdotal. One retired forestry worker recalled an incident decades prior when hikers claimed to find small, polished stones with metallic luster along a ridge, only for them to vanish before anyone could record their presence. Such accounts were rarely documented, but the echoes of these earlier events intensified the mystery of the current fragments. It was as if Schauinsland had a rhythm of revelation, presenting objects momentarily before withdrawing them into the forest itself. Preservation and transport of the fragments proved impossible despite repeated attempts. Crates and bags brought by authorities and collectors were left unattended only briefly, yet upon returning, the pieces had shifted, diminished, or disappeared entirely. Photographs captured glints of light, but some images later showed gaps where the fragments had been in real time. Even satellite imagery proved inconclusive. The slope revealed nothing unusual beyond fallen branches and wet soil. Each failed attempt reinforced the sense that the mountain acted independently, controlling the narrative of what could be observed and recorded. By the end of the week, what little evidence remained had become maddeningly inconsistent. Shards once clustered together were now gone, and those who had touched or measured them described subtle sensations, a fleeting warmth, the faintest vibration, or the unsettling impression that the fragments themselves were aware of their observers. The forest seemed indifferent yet sentient, allowing humans brief access to objects beyond their comprehension before reclaiming them silently. The mountain had revealed something real, tangible, and impossible to explain, leaving both fear and fascination in its wake. The Schauinsland unidentified wreckage remains a rare instance of the Black Forest producing something physical and ephemeral, a mystery where even evidence refuses permanence. The forest slopes, steep and shadowed, hold secrets that appear and vanish with the weather, offering only glimpses of what lies hidden beneath. Observers, both casual and expert, are left with fragments of understanding but no closure, as if the mountain itself tests human curiosity and restraint. Once the storm clouds parted and the fragments disappeared, the Schauinsland slopes lay silent, as though the wreckage had never existed. The Schwarzwald meteor that left no stone. The Schwarzwald sky shifted abruptly, as if the heavens themselves had been split by an invisible force. Clouds swirled in erratic patterns, illuminated by a sudden fierce streak of light that cut across the horizon. Treetops shivered under the wind that surged in response, their needles rattling against each other in an unnatural rhythm. Streams reflected the brilliance momentarily, catching a flicker of white-hot intensity before it vanished into the higher atmosphere. It was during this fleeting spectacle that the forest seemed to hold its breath, every ridge and hollow suspended in a rare stillness, anticipating something that no one could yet name, the Schwarzwald meteor that left no stone. By the time villagers and hikers noticed the aftermath, the sky had returned to its muted grey calm. Yet the forest still bore subtle marks of the event. Shadows hung longer, distorted by the sudden brilliance, and certain slopes glowed faintly, as if the earth itself remembered the streak that had passed. Animals remained unusually quiet, and the wind carried an almost imperceptible hum that locals later described as resonating through the bones of the hills. Those who had ventured to lookout points reported brief flashes of light reflecting off distant slopes, but when approached, the glints disappeared as though the forest had absorbed them. Rangers and scientific observers arrived quickly, drawn by both reports of the luminous streak and the unusual atmospheric readings recorded by regional weather stations. Instruments indicated a momentary spike in thermal activity and light intensity, consistent with a meteoric object passing through the atmosphere at high velocity. Yet no crater, scorched earth, or fragments could be located on the slopes below. Satellite images confirmed the anomaly in the sky but revealed no impact site, and aerial surveys turned up nothing but untouched soil and resilient firs bent by the pre-existing winds. The paradox deepened. A meteor that had burned visibly across the forest sky yet left no evidence of its touch on the ground. Historical records offered little consolation. While the Black Forest had long been the site of meteor sightings and occasional fallen fragments, there were no comparable incidents documented in the past century that mirrored the Schwarzwald event. Local accounts hinted at rare celestial phenomena, but most were dismissed as folklore or optical illusions. This meteor, however, had been witnessed simultaneously by multiple observers across villages and forested valleys, making it unlike the misperceptions of old tales. It was a shared, undeniable experience whose physical trace had been erased, leaving the witnesses with only memory and speculation. The forest itself became part of the narrative, its ancient slopes silently cataloguing the fleeting phenomenon. Light had touched the moss-covered rocks, shimmered off water in the creeks, and cast elongated shadows through the firs. When sunlight returned fully, the subtle disruptions in the undergrowth, flattened grasses, and faintly disturbed soil hinted at movement, yet the fragments themselves were nowhere to be found. Attempts to trace any magnetic anomalies or unusual mineral deposits were equally unproductive. Instruments reported only the normal variations in soil composition. Scholars noted that the scale of the light and heat should have resulted in scattered debris, yet there was nothing to reconcile the observed meteor with the forest floor below. In villages surrounding the mountain, conversations lingered for weeks. Families debated whether the meteor had been a small fragment of a larger cosmic body that burned entirely in the atmosphere, or a rare event in which energy was released without physical remnants reaching the Earth. Folklorists suggested that the forest might have absorbed the event into its own rhythms, preserving it in memory and shadow rather than stone. Children recounted the night as a time when the skies breathed fire, while older residents whispered of omens and celestial warnings, unwilling to challenge the phenomenon with definitive explanations. Scientists returned sporadically, retracing paths and slopes with magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, and soil probes, yet each survey confirmed the same conclusion. The Schwarzwald had offered a spectacle without residue. Every footprint of human curiosity met only silence, and every calculation of trajectory ended in open air. The forest, which had endured centuries of storms, human interference, and the fall of countless rocks and branches, had kept the meteor from leaving a mark. It existed in memory, observation, and speculation, but never on the soil itself. The Schwarzwald meteor that left no stone became a story told more than studied, a phenomenon that challenged both empirical reasoning and human expectation. Witnesses spoke of the brilliance in the sky and the echo of sound that lingered for moments longer than physics should allow. Yet, when the searchers combed the slopes, there was nothing tangible to measure, touch, or analyse. In this absence, the forest assumed its role as guardian of mysteries, silently reminding all who approached that not every event can be contained, documented, or explained. When the light faded and the hills returned to their quiet slopes, the Schwarzwald held nothing but the memory of a meteor that had burned brightly across the sky and disappeared without a trace.